You guys are a lot smarter than a lot of other podcasts I've been on.
Well, look,
Thank you.
you have a standing invitation here. You reach out to me if you want to come on
You're too
and
kind.
just review a video with us, just test out a new idea, whatever you want. Like, we have a bunch of people that just pop in and come on the show whenever they're available.
Hey now, it's your boy PSA Sitch here with another Sunday stream with everyone's favorite spectral investigator, Adam Friendon.
Oh, what's up? How's it going? I like that intro.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm all for investigating the spectral, whatever that is. And look, we're here with an amazing guest on the show. I love this guy's videos. What If Alt Hist is his channel. It's amazing. Everyone should check it out. And your name is Rudyard, right? Am I pronouncing that correctly?
You're one of the few people to pronounce it correctly.
Okay, Rudyard,
Nice.
but Rudyard Kipling, I think, is who you're named after, right? That's like the famous Rudyard. So, but you're Rudyard Lynch, and Lynch is also, I mean, who doesn't love David Lynch, right? You got like the perfect name here. So, we were just talking a bit before the stream. I mean, if you want to just go into, like, the conversation started getting so interesting so quick.
Yeah.
We were like, okay, we better just go live here.
So before the show, we were talking about how the CIA and the Soviets had various experiments in the spirit world during the Cold War, and they found some really interesting stuff. And what I was saying was that academia will take information that's not really valid and shove it into a pre-existing worldview. And then there's stuff that has much more evidence behind that just won't make it in. And the reason I said for that is that we confused what priest classes do with what scientists do. And every society has to have a priest class. And you look over history, every society ever is religious. And so when you remove religion, you end up with it kind of seeping into a bunch of other places like fan culture. People treat Star Wars like a religion, into science, into politics, etc. And so an example of what's moral and what's factual, and they have to be kind of intertwined, because if you have a worldview that's like, you can't have a moral code that's completely separated from what the real world is. But for example, I believe war has to always happen. War is an inbuilt part of the natural order, where if societies don't have war, they grow weak and silly. But I don't think war is good. I'm not going to pretend that war is an amazing thing. And so there's that separation there of what's moral and what's true. And then we've removed that separation. And so you can't, when you're looking at the scientific truth, it gets conflated with what people want to believe. And then once those two need to be separate. And if you don't make them separate, they mess with each other. Where if the science isn't allowed to see the truth, it'll basically be corrupted. And what you end up with is people manipulating both for their own personal gain. And I think that's what we've done in our society, where we've basically created a religion around what gives people with college degrees the most power. And I think, I mean, this is
I use that thing.
The left. I think the left is a religion based on giving people with college degrees more power.
Yeah, I use that. You said that in a video, and it really just clicked for me. And I mean, I think I have it in my notes somewhere. I have mentioned it more than once.
Yeah.
That theory that leftist politics is really just about empowering college graduates. I think it's this totally interesting idea. But just to go back to the war thing just for a second. Like, is there another means to do it? I mean, people often say politics is war by other means. Like, I would hope as the future goes on, we can find a way to maintain our strength as a culture without actually, engaging in tribal warfare.
It depends on what time frame you're looking at. And for me, because my speciality is history, I look at things over thousands of years. And over that perspective, there's no way in hell we don't have a war. However, you can look at periods of like 100 years or 200 years, and there's not a war. And the only time in history where you don't have major wars is because one great power is strong enough that it's capable of making war uneconomical for everyone else involved. So the Romans, the British, etc.
The Americans, let's be clear here.
And interestingly, over the 20th century, we've seen we've seen alternatives to war, where the fall of the Soviet Union, decolonization, and the reason most people get scared of war is by how traumatic the world wars were. Because when people predict the future, they always go back to the last alternative and think it's the next thing. But because the end point of the world wars was that millions of people died, the European continent got fried, we nearly had a nuclear holocaust. But I don't think that has to be the future of war. And so what I've said in my videos is I think that if we have a major war, it'll be a decentralized, more limited war, and that sort of thing. It's not the horrible world wars that can wipe out a society in 4 years. It's more something where, like, for example, in the 1700s, you could trade with or go on vacation to a country you were at war with. And that's a completely different. Yeah, for real. Like, people were.
That's crazy.
And back in the 1700s, people would literally have dinner with the opposing army before the battle because they were all gentlemen and it wasn't personal.
Wow. Okay. That's kind of crazy.
And so when people think of war, there's only 2 eras of history that have these giant, like, empire breaking periods. And that's something that we don't really think about today, because when we think war, our first thought is nuclear Armageddon.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's, so another thing that we talked about before the stream started, which I think people will be interested in, is I was saying that I think we have a lot of overlap in our book selections. We mentioned The Righteous Mind. You had said quite equivocally that The Righteous Mind had changed your life. You want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I really loved The Righteous Mind, and it really changed how I viewed the world. And the reason, for those that haven't read it, and I really want to bring John Haidt in my podcast, what John Haidt does is he studies the psychology of politics, where he goes through that there are these 6 pillars that all societies have to differing degrees, and they're ingrained in our biology based off certain biological self-interests. And these include liberty, harm, fairness, authority, and purity. And different parts of the political spectrum pull on them. And human nature is 90% irrational and about 10% irrational. And we choose different irrational points to start from. And then we use rationality or rationalizations to justify where we end up. And that really changed how I viewed the world, because beforehand you have this idea that the right and the left are these, you didn't really have a frame of reference to understand why they were different and what they were really about. And that was a big turning point for me, because you could suddenly see the architecture behind these different beliefs. And also I could compare it to other historic societies, because you can go back and compare certain political views to pre-industrial religions. And that was really a big turning point for me, because I was able to kind of deconstruct the worldview of both the right and the left on a more clinical basis.
Right. Mm-hmm. Are you familiar with?
I actually want to ask you about this, because I want to ask you, how do you define the right versus the left? And have you seen Haidt's kind of right-left moral foundations breakdown in history? Or is it like a recent thing?
Interesting.
Oh, great question.
Sorry about the background noise. My neighbor's mowing his lawn.
We can't hear any of it. Zoom actually cuts a lot of that stuff out.
That's incredible.
So, it sounds great.
I was worried about that. But
sounds awesome.
So these things, the right and the left today, they're broad coalitions that don't really have a shared. They're not like back in Stalinism, where in Stalin's Russia, everyone believed the exact same thing, and if you didn't, you were shot. Where the right and the left are broad coalitions that don't really share that much. I see the left as a descendant of Gnosticism, and that's kind of this kind of schizo rabbit hole that I've seen a couple of other people fall down, where Gnosticism was this ancient religion from the Middle East, and it was kind of its own thing, but it would latch on to Judaism or Christianity or Islam or other religions And it's kind of like if you split Christianity and Buddhism, where Gnostics believe that the world is an evil conspiracy by the devil. And for people listening in the audience, wait till the end. I know this is going to sound weird, but suspend disbelief for about a minute. Where Gnostics believed that the earth is inherently evil and the world is an evil conspiracy by Satan to basically torture souls. And then there is this secret God that gives people this hidden knowledge, and that the people with the hidden knowledge can realize that they can become gods and then break the evil conspiracy. And this was a very common belief, but it wasn't able to gain widespread adherence among the majority population. So it kind of bumped around secret associations. And it was big in the Middle Ages because this was a very religious society where every educated person knew religious philosophy. And then it was big in the early modern period. And then Hegel, these people would use certain terminology to make others aware that you were a Gnostic. And Hegel used a lot of this terminology, and Marx based it off Hegel. But if you look at the left today, people study people's beliefs at face value and not realize what is this belief getting and what is the underlying worldview. And for the left, their underlying worldview is everything is an evil conspiracy that we have to deconstruct. And we are the people with the hidden knowledge. And thus, anyone who disagrees with us has to either be evil or stupid. And this is one of the things I see with the left. The right is capable of believing that its opponents are just misguided or are people who are intelligent with different upbringings that came to different conclusions. And so if you also look at the left, they believe the second that they win, the world will become a utopia. And that belief structure only makes sense from a Gnostic framework because the Gnostics believe the world's an evil conspiracy. And once you remove that, you'll be living in a utopia. And so the left, I don't think the people involved knew what they were doing. These were ideas that were kind of in circulation. And over time, they evolved into it because these are ideas that are very psychologically palatable. And so one of the things with John Haidt is that the left has 2 or 3 psychological foundations. They care a lot about harm. They care a lot about liberty. And then they've recently become obsessed with purity. And it's funny that the radical left is the most obsessed with purity of any population in America, or maybe even the world. It wouldn't surprise me if woke people are more puritanical than the Taliban, if I'm honest.
I don't disagree.
One of my buddies was captured by the Taliban, and
wow,
he lived with them for 6 months. And it was ironic where, having spoken to him, I would legitimately say that there are ways where woke people are more puritanical than the Taliban. But the thing is that with the left, they come from this worldview where everything is an evil conspiracy, and that's just not the reality. I'm sorry, this is taking a long for me to explain, but the reality of the world is everyone is struggling for survival against a bunch of other groups, and people always try to find edges over other groups. Where, for example, from the left's perspective, men oppress women because men are brutal. However, if you look over the entire course of history, if men could have gotten a strategic edge by giving women, by basically doing feminism 1,000 years ago, you would have seen feminism 1,000 years ago. And so the left doesn't see the world through any lens of practicality, which leads me back to them having a worldview that stems from Gnosticism.
It seems like the right has adopted, in a lot of respects, the everything is a conspiracy now too, because everything's the deep state.
Yeah, it's sad actually, because I predicted the right going off the rails a little bit ago, and we were talking at the tweet I released before, where I put out a tweet saying we're about a year away from someone on the right saying I'm unironically a fascist, and then having all the comments be based. And then the tweet went viral. It got 750,000 views. And all the comments are based, I am unironically a fascist. And
we're already there.
It makes me sad because I'm a classical liberal. And I built a lot of my identity around that. And I love freedom and democracy and all that stuff. And I saw this coming. I talked about it, and then it just kind of happened. And what happens because people feel so disempowered today because they're broke, they're depressed, they're lonely. They look for conspiracy theories to explain it, and it's kind of I'm kind of scared to see where the right's going to go. And the right also does have, like, Nazism is also a descendant of Gnosticism. And the reason that both the far right and the far left kind of get that conspiracy worldview is because once you remove traditional religion, you remove any sense that the world has order. And so once you lose the sense of order, you kind of jumped, like the next easy psychological jump is that everything's an evil conspiracy. And where I see the right going, the thing that scares you the most at the where the right is going is the lack of empathy. Because for a lot of the right today, if you suggest, like, hey, can we please be a little bit kinder about this? Can we please not go full barbarian? People will call you a cuck. And the left boy who called wolf the right, where, and I saw this for like 10 years. I was thinking about this, where the left is the left's top dominant strategy is baiting into hazard, or basically annoying people so much they do something dumb. And I think that that's probably the left's strategy, where they're trying to basically bait the right. They're master baiters. They're trying to bait the right into doing something crazy, but they don't seem to understand that the right's military power, the right controls all force in America. The right has the military, it has the police, it has the gun owners, it has the resources, the internal transportation. And so I think things are going to get ugly, and I'm scared, if I'm honest.
Yeah, it seems like the left kind of has been crying wolf for a long time about racism, sexism, so that when the actual racists and sexists show up, it's kind of like, oh, they're probably lying. And it was the same thing with the right, kind of cried wolf about socialism. And now that the actual socialists are here, it's like, oh, well, I'm not going to listen to you anymore.
And it's funny. I think a lot of socialists are better served on the right than the left at this point. Because one of my friends said,
really?
There are loads of people on the MAGA right who would have positions that are identical to that of a member of the American Communist Party in 1930.
Jackson Henkel.
Big corporations are terrible. The rich are grinding us into the dirt. The giant multinational corporations are destroying our culture. And I've had this debate with my father for like 5 years, where we were talking about, is the right or the left basically an unconscious vortex that acts on its own, or is it run by a small cabal? And the conclusion I've come to is it's both at the same time, and that the small cabal is in competition with the social justice vortex. And I think over the last couple of years, with like, the left has become more corporate, and so you're seeing a lot of these choices made by the top cabal. And then because of that, the right has been able to become more populist. And at this point, I don't really see the American right having any real identity. It's just people who aren't part of the left.
Well, let me give you...
I just want to ask on the fascism conspiracy brain thing. You mentioned that you thought it was economically driven. I think a lot of people, obviously they call it the culture war. They think it's philosophically driven. But I'm often torn. I think the philosophy and the economic conditions are intertwined to some respect. Obviously, how you conceptualize your economic conditions, philosophy can help make better or worse. But I do think a lot of it ultimately has to be driven by economics. What is your take?
I definitely agree. I mean, everything's everything. It's why I make 40-minute video essays. If the answers were easier, my videos would just be, people are poor and they're angry. Done.
Yes, totally. Yeah.
But I mean, history comes and goes like an ocean current. And when the storm smashes up against the beach, when the waters are ready, there's a lot of random flotsam and stuff from further out that get washed up. And we can actually predict when societies have revolutions through economic data. So the underlying driver is economic. And there's this really cool data scientist named Peter Turchin, who has a computer model that his stuff's amazing. He's been able to predict the Russian Civil War, the French Revolution, the fall of Rome, the fall of the Roman Republic, the Black Death.
You're talking about elite overproduction, right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
where he controls for three variables: inequality, average wages, and elite overproduction, which is basically people trying to get into good jobs. And using those three variables, plugging it over history, he's been able to predict when countries have revolutions and civil wars. And so in 2010, he said that we would have that in 2020. And so I don't think most Americans realize how rough. I mean, the lives of Americans economically are rough, but I think it's compounded by a bunch of other stuff like the breakdown in community, religion, shared culture, etc., where people aren't starving, but because we've removed those shared things, people don't have to be starving to have a revolution. And I think the economics is pushing this to breaking point, and then there's a bunch of other variables that make it worse in different ways.
Yeah, I know you're a James Lindsay fan. James Lindsay did a podcast on this elite overproduction thing, and it was before I had encountered Turchin's
I
research.
didn't know Lindsay talked about that. I just got it from Turchin.
Look, I DM'd Lindsay, and Lindsay hadn't read Turchin either. He just came up with it on his own. But Lindsay was in the PhD program, and he could see the elite overproduction like firsthand. So he did this podcast. It was just such a black pill. I was like, all these kids are getting all of these PhD degrees, and there's absolutely no place in society for them. They're gonna be revolutionaries. It's impossible for them not to be.
I saw that at age 22. I mean, I'm age 22, and when I went to high school, I didn't know how to explain this stuff, but I could intuitively pick up on a lot of it just looking at people's lives. And I grew up in Pennsylvania, which is part of the Rust Belt, and so that adds another degree of desperation to things. But I'd see people working really hard in high school, and I didn't really do that. I was kind of an edgelord in high school, and I didn't try that hard.
Based. The way to be, smoking weed in the bushes.
Yeah. But I saw these kids and I thought, you guys are working, because for a lot of them, they were working like 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, doing various stuff. It's like China level things. I remember seeing a girl break down in tears when she had an hour free in senior year because she didn't know what to do with that. And having an hour free was an existential crisis. So I was thinking to myself, and I heard all these stories of people out of college, you guys are working super hard, and I know there's not a payoff at the end. So why are you guys doing this? And I worked hard on, I remember I had a calculation my senior year of high school. I'm not going to be successful in the conventional route. And I developed 5 different things I could try to do as an entrepreneur because I knew I wouldn't make it on the conventional route. But I think there's this like awakening black pill among the population, especially people in my age, that they're just screwed on a bunch of different things, whether economically, dating, socially.
Dating is a whole nother. Oh man,
I actually think I call it the dating and the marriage crisis is the #1 revolution driver today. I think it's more than economics, actually.
Yeah, it's tough. Go ahead, Sitch.
What was being on YouTube one of your plans, or did that?
I didn't expect it. It kind of just happened. I never planned on being on YouTube because being a YouTube public intellectual wasn't even a career when I was high school.
Right.
And I remember I was rewatching iCarly and I was looking at iCarly's live stream stats, and I saw that and I thought, this girl in 2010 is supposed to be one of the top content creators. She would not be able to live off those stats today. So that's just how fast the internet grew. And what happened was that I was stuck at home during COVID during my gap year, and I was just bored out of my mind. And I had around 60,000 subscribers, and I was still doing alternate history back then. Like, what if the South won the Civil War? Or what if the Nazis won World War II? And I just worked on my channel full time when I was stuck at home during COVID. Then I went to college, and my channel really took off my first semester of college. And I was making enough money that I didn't really have I just looked at one of my checks in December of freshman year, and I thought, I can't stay in school. And I was working myself to death where I do my classwork and then I do my full-time YouTube job. And I wasn't an alcoholic, but I was drinking more than I liked to basically calm my nerves. And so and then I met one of my friends who was a digital nomad living in Mexico. And then he basically said, hey, Rudyard, do you want to drop out of school and move to Mexico with me? And so I did that. And I didn't decide to be a YouTuber until it was just my job already.
Right. Interesting. Okay. So you said a lot of things that I think are very true. Conspiracy is bred out of a lack of order in people's lives. And let's see. And that the lack of religion has led to faith bleeding into science. And also, I'm assuming you mean like also in kind of wokeness has become its own religion as well. But I want to go back to in the beginning. You said that you were doing a bunch of reading on the CIA and Russia's experiments into the spirit world, which interests me a lot.
This is a rabbit hole that I've been stuck on for a long time. And I'm going to end up making like 10 videos about it. But I'm kind of obsessive with how I make videos where I don't feel I've done a good enough job unless I've read like 10 books on the topic.
That's
so
good. Yeah.
I've been studying this topic a lot. And the CIA did these studies in the 60s and the 70s where they'd play sound frequencies and then have people lie in bed or lie down. And they were consistently able to find that people would astral project out of their body. And they were able to get evidence for...
Wait, this has been documented?
Yeah, the CIA was doing this for 15 years. And then the report on it was all the science is correct for this.
But like this is an official CIA report. It says like we were able to get people to astral project on command.
Yeah, this is look at the Gateway report, and then the military.
You doubt that, Sitch?
I'm just shocked.
Yeah, it's called Gateway, and it's all public data. It was released in 2016.
Nice.
And then the military's report was all the science in the Gateway project was correct. Just they didn't have enough people in the field to validate it.
Mm-hmm.
Where they ran through a couple different kinds of biometric. They had like 3 or 4 different scientific ways of analyzing what was going on at the time, where they could astral project out of their bodies and they could go to the neighbor's house, see what the neighbor is doing at a certain time, ask the neighbor about details of it. And they were able to get data that was correct enough that they weren't making it up. Or they could read numbers on the other side of the room, or the other side of the country in a certain room. But the problem was the further you get out, the more your mind messes with this. So they could read a number, like they'd have a room on the other side of the country, and then people would use their minds to basically read the numbers. And enough of the numbers were correct that they knew they weren't making it up. But at the same time, it wasn't enough that it was perfect. And what they found is the further you get out into the spirit world, the more it doesn't relate to what's actually going on in the physical world. The more your ideas and mindset and your own psychological state mixes with it. And what the Soviets also did in the Czech Republic at the exact same time, and you got to love the Soviets for stuff like this, is they gave 4,000 people giant amounts of LSD over extended periods of time and then interviewed them. And what they found was for Dante's Inferno, the further you get out from Dante, the weirder hell gets. And this was a concept in the pre-industrial mystic traditions because back in pre-industrial societies, they didn't have a concept of splitting off the psychological world and the physical world. So if you do these weird spirit quests, they just thought that was outer space and you were going into physical outer space. And so basically the further out, and for both the Gateway and the Soviet ones in Czechia, there's this kind of map where the further you get out, the more abstract it is, where you'll talk to like a god. Then beyond that is the incredible unknown. And it's more degrees of abstraction and difficulty to understand. And I don't fully buy all of this. I mean, whenever you find new stuff, a lot of it turns out to be wrong in retrospect. But the thing that makes me kind of wink at it is that literally every other society in history believed in this stuff. And we in the modern world are the weird ones out. And our reason for not believing it is just that we can't document it. And like we have records of like in ancient India, the priest classes would take psychedelics, or they would meditate, and then they also built a mental model that's exactly the same as what these two experiments are talking about. And you also have a similar tradition in pre-modern Europe, where the priest classes of all these ancient societies would go on, they would have these encounters with the spirit world. And this is something that we hide in modern Christianity, but like Isaac Newton was obsessed with this stuff. He studied the esoteric as nearly as much as he studied physics. The founding fathers were steeped in this stuff. And so a lot of the choices for like the currency are esoteric symbols to further the republic, because the Freemasons were talking about this stuff. And I think that there's a theory of the world here that we haven't really locked onto that needs serious study. And I don't know, when I make videos of this, I'm assuming a lot of the stuff I'm going to say is bullshit, but I think someone should at least talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's crazy. Like, so if the CIA was able to replicate with some consistency that people could project and they would get, I don't know, like 50, 60% accuracy on some of the stuff. I mean, it's just wild to me that that wasn't taken seriously and is not being researched outside of, some top secret lab somewhere. I mean, unless it is all being researched just secretly. Just, I don't understand how that could just fall into the cracks.
The thing is, it doesn't fit with the modernist worldview well enough, where it makes me think of back in the Middle Ages, they would find fossilized sea animals in the middle of the land. Like in the middle of the continent, you'd find a fossilized seashell or a dinosaur. And what the medieval Catholic Church said was that these were aberrations designed by God to test our faith in him.
Right.
And in retrospect, you can see that's kind of a stretch. But if you look over history, you find that people build paradigms of the world, and then you see enough cracks in it over time that the paradigm breaks and you build a new one. And the universe is infinitely large. So there are infinite theories you can use to explain the world. And we just pick a handful that work for our society. And so what I think happened was just no one knew what to do with this. Where imagine in the 60s, if the CIA had released all this astral projection stuff. And I don't want to go like this is stuff conspiracy theorists say, but our entire society is built off a right to rule of the material world being everything. That would challenge academia, would challenge the military, would challenge the government. And I mean, what happened when they finally did release it in 2016 is that the guy who ran the experiment, James Monroe, he had a page about how the teachings, that the things he figured out were applicable to world religions. And then the CIA just removed that page because they didn't want people thinking of the applicability for religions and peace and stuff. And then Monroe released the version with the pages just to fuck with them. And so it's just, I think it was too much to bear, and they were scared of what the social implications would be. And the reason this stuff is coming out now and people like Joe Rogan like it so much is because our society is falling apart and people are desperate to find something else. But I think even 10 years ago, I might have written this off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny because I know, when I was younger, I kind of went into the astral projection rabbit hole too. And I wasn't looking at it from the CIA. I didn't know anything about the CIA studying it. But I just reading a bunch of kind of, mystical hippie books about it. And it's funny because some of the ones I read would say the same thing about how you can project somewhere and you'll see things that are kind of real, but the closer you get to the spirit realm, everything becomes kind of fucky, and you're not really, seeing what is real anymore. So it's funny to see the CIA basically replicate that or say the same thing.
What I think is that in physics, everything has to have its counterpoint. You see this across the universe, where matter has antimatter. You have the night and the day on Earth. Humans replicate through man and woman. War and peace. Duality exists everywhere. And for something to exist, you have to have its opposite. Like life couldn't exist without death. And one of the things that I've gotten from ancient sources, but also the CIA stuff, is that the law of the spirit world is that anything you think is possible. It's limitless and it exists out of time. And the nature of our reality is that everything's incredibly finite, where every part of our lives is based off finiteness. We try to escape it. And so I think that kind of for our world to exist, you need its opposite. And that's kind of what the spirit world is, where it's real, but it's not real at the same time, where like you could see a horrible demon and that means nothing to you and the rest of your life is fine. Where it's balanced between where the realness of our world kind of needs its opposite. And I don't know if I'm making sense here.
Yeah, no, like I don't know if I'd use the word real. I'd say like, we have this world that we call real. It's physical.
Yeah.
And everything is very like static and solid. Things require a lot of force to change or manipulate because everything's like heavy. And if there's some opposite to that, like a spirit world, everything would be kind of etherical and fluid and easy to move, and that's why you could do whatever you want.
Yeah.
So it's very fascinating.
What you want to go on to the to the tweet you got? I have a bunch. Look, we've kind
I was
of
going to ask
on
him about the free time question if you want.
Well, okay. Before we move on, I'm totally down with this whole, like, we need to try out ideas that are probably wrong. Like, I'm constantly doing that. People are like, you got to have some willpower to do this because people will get really pissed off as soon as you start testing out new ideas. So props to you for doing it. I love doing it on the show. I'm constantly trying to find new ideas. One new idea that I encountered recently, and it's funny because it's like Tim Pool's always talking about Civil War, and I always like kind of threw that away. I'm like, okay, he's just like insane. But then I read the Fourth Turning is Here and the Peter Turchin book like back to back, and there's so much overlap. Cleodynamics is this science of history. I'm going, I never encountered any of this stuff before. So now all of a sudden I'm listening to Tim Pool and all the stuff he's saying. It seems kind of plausible here.
I mean, I don't know where else we can go because in the modern America, we don't really think things can get as bad as they can. But if you read enough history, you realize
exactly
that all the time. And I look at our politics where we can't agree on anything, or we're so silly, and there's entrenched interests everywhere where, I mean, people talk about how you buy a house, you have to get your interior decoration improved by the local zoning board. You have to get your back fly screen approved by the local zoning board. And it feels like things are so tense. And I don't know if it'll be a civil war. And the reason I say that, I bet good money that we'll have political violence in the next couple of years. I don't know if it'll be a civil war, but I think the right would just win. And because when it comes to military power, the right has the army, or most of the army, the police, young men as a general demographic, and aggressive young men especially. It has control of resources, a centralized location. And I could be wrong here. It could be because I always say on my show, I'm betting against God, and there's infinity ways to be wrong, and only about a handful to be right.
True. Yeah.
And so I could be miscalculating where enough of the military tilts left that we would have a civil war. But my best guess is the right kills the left, and then we kind of fracture into warlords and conflict between the right because the right doesn't have enough internal unity, and also due to the breakdown of law and authority, which is something I'm working on a video right now where, for example, almost no cities in America have budgets. So something bad happens, every major city in America can't pay for police officers or social workers. And what happens once you've, like the Andrew Tates of the world, have congregated armies of young men to follow their orders?
Yeah.
I think
kind of bleak.
In terms of like who would win this, like a quote civil war, I think it would depend highly on the context of why it's happening. Because if for example, if Trump got Pence to throw out the electoral votes from those swing states and they just declared Trump, president, and that kind of degraded into some kind of civil war situation. Like, I'm not sure the military, even if most people in it leaned right wing, I'm not sure that they would say, well, we're going to support this like very anti-demographic and anti-democratic, thing that's just happened.
You're exactly right. The one condition where I see the left winning is where they basically bait the right into doing something retarded, and then the right gets fried. Where that's a really plausible scenario. And
I mean, we're seeing it. I feel like.
Yeah, I mean, you're looking at the next like, I don't even know. I think we have about a year until stuff gets bad, because I don't think either side will trust the results for this next election unless one side wins by a landslide. And then even if like the polls now say Trump is leading by 10 points, even if that happens, I'm not sure the Democrats would accept that. And so, but also, I mean, you guys saw how we passed a budget for 45 days and it only barely passed.
Yeah.
And if the government shuts down, what happens next? And I mean, what happens if Trump goes to jail? There's all these, it's like World War One, where there were about 10 places where World War One could have happened because all of the historic forces built up to it. And it just happened to be in Serbia. And we're in the same place where we have all of these problems built up for a historic crisis. We just haven't seen where the match gets lit, where the entire floor is covered in gunpowder.
Yeah, it's hard because, like, and I remember watching this, and this kind of blackpilled me watching kind of the build up to Russia invading Crimea. And I'd watch like a lot of the Ukrainians kind of interact with the Russians and all this stuff. And it seemed like everyone was kind of LARPing until they weren't. And I've kind of come to this like bad idea that people basically LARP themselves into war, because it's hard to like right now I look around, I'm like, yeah, I see a lot of people are very divided. I see a lot of people very angry, but it's still hard for me to conceptualize how that turns into some kind of like factions fighting each other in the streets, you know, over politics or something.
One of the points Turchin makes is that we don't have like revolution organizations. But what I'd say is that the internet allows that very easily, where I don't think people have really realized the potential that the internet has for group organization or for strategy, where you could launch a revolution out of a subreddit if you wanted. I mean, that might be a bit far because you get banned, but and also you only need a single match to go off, and then people start organizing. And I agree. It's LARPing until it isn't. And think of COVID, where people in that field were saying that we were due for a pandemic for decades, and then COVID hit. And I remember I was in Peru when COVID hit, and I had a friend from China who called me up and he said, this stuff's really bad. You need to get back to America now. And then I got out of Peru on the last flight that they had to America.
Wow.
No, it was the last flight. And I got there on the last call. But things like this shit can go down really fast if all the variables are lined up. And I mean, January of 2020, we had no idea what was going on. And in March, our entire lives had changed.
Yeah, it's still just hard for me to think about, like, I mean, I can see a world where, you know, Antifa or leftist groups and Proud Boy-like groups are like basically fighting each other, but it's still it's too difficult for me. My imagination is too limited to kind of conceptualize, like, you know, the Congress is like doesn't exist, or like the Republicans and Democrats are in the streets like shooting at each other. Like, even if Trump gets arrested, I can't really see that unless something really insane happens regarding the election.
I agree with that.
They have firsthand accounts of like the Civil War and stuff, and people during the Civil War didn't see it coming.
Yeah.
So I mean,
like, but there's a big difference. Like, so in the Civil War, it's like there's literally just this fear of your entire life in the South is going to be changed by getting rid of slavery. Like this entire, like there's a very specific, very physical, very tangible thing that's happening. Where with this, it's kind of etherical, like what exactly, you know, people like debating over politics. Like, obviously material conditions are making everyone crazy, but there's not like a specific material condition everyone's like really focused on as the central point here.
They incarcerate Trump.
Yeah, but I don't think that's enough.
You don't think that's enough to really
incarcerate Trump? Election doesn't work out. I mean, for all of the secular crises, or most of them, what the thing that spurs it is a budget problem. And that's how the French Revolution started, where ironically, the French government doing the American Revolution was one of the biggest things that caused the French Revolution because they couldn't afford to support the American colonies, where the French government just couldn't pay its bills, and they convened the Congress together. And then the Congress said, unless you don't turn France into a democracy, we're not going to let you raise taxes. And then that's what caused the French Revolution. And that's pretty common. And so if I had to bet on anything, it would be that the next time we try to pass a budget, it just doesn't work. And that sounds kind of nerdy, but like, I mean, it's like, imagine you're married and you hate your partner and you get into an argument over money. The number one cause for divorces is money problems. And that's my best bet. And I mean, we've barely passed it the last couple of times where, and each time it's passed with the Republicans making concessions, but past a certain point, you end up in a situation where the leaders are incentivized to launch a civil war, because by launching a civil war, they get to stay in power. And if they make concessions, they won't get reelected.
I mean, I can always think of a dozen things. Like what if the election is contested and Putin invades a NATO country during the contested election? What if Putin invades a NATO country during another January 6th? Like there's a million things that I can think of that could happen to really take the wheels off of this thing.
It's like it's interesting where a couple years ago I would have unanimously supported, if China invaded Taiwan, I would have supported America going to war with China. And I don't support that anymore because I think if we had a war with China now, it would break the U.S.
Do you think Putin and China are talking to one another? What if China takes Taiwan at the same exact time Putin invades Poland?
One of my friends, Philippe Fabry, he kind of does the same stuff I do, where he uses the cycles of history to predict the future, and he's based out of France. And that's what he predicts, that Putin will go after the Baltics afterwards. I personally think Putin would be insane to do that because the Russian military's performance in Ukraine, like, they wouldn't survive an invasion of a NATO country.
He doesn't have to be insane. He just has to have nothing to lose, which I think you can make an argument that he has nothing to lose.
He has to have something to gain.
Peter Zeihan says is, and I just finished, I have a video in the works for why I think Russia will have a revolution in the next couple of years. And I mean, past a certain point, I don't know. Chaos. I'm betting against God. It could happen. I can't say. But
Putin right now is praying for a contested election. You know he is, because he's hanging on by the skin of his teeth in Ukraine. And he knows if America and Europe stop sending them weapons, it's over.
I also think that as a young man in Russia, I don't know why I'd be fighting. Because I'd imagine they have the same economic and dating and whatever problems we have in America. And if you're just going to be cannon fodder in a useless war, why don't you mutiny? And I think the Chinese and the Russians could go for that. And if we had to wage a war, it's like extra couple problem, where you have a couple that's already worried about money and they fight over how they spend it. And then their mother has an enormous medical bill, and the husband hates his wife's mother anyway, and so he's not going to give away his money for that, and then they divorce. It's kind of a similar situation.
Yeah.
Do you think, though, is it the budget that's the problem, or is it people in terms of how the economy is doing? Like if we had like a 2008 housing crash now, like again, they're all worried about the commercial housing market and stuff like that. Like maybe that would cause the problem, because with the budget stuff, I mean, I'm assuming with France at the time, they were not on fiat currency. So I feel like now the government can just basically print itself out of any problem.
A stock market crash, though, you can't really print yourself.
That's why I'm saying,
I mean, I think all of the above is going to happen, because we're at a place where I think we have to have a stock market crash or some kind of equalization of the stock market. I actually think it's a decently likely scenario that, like, rightist rebels just wipe out the major coastal corporations. I think if you have a rightist revolution, there's a solid chance they just wipe out Hollywood and Silicon Valley, and they might leave Wall Street.
When you say wipe out, are you talking about economically or like with force? Like
yeah, let's hope it's economically. I live here.
With force.
You think like people are gonna like march into Apple and stuff? Like what do you mean?
Why not? I mean, they don't those companies anyway.
Right.
And I mean, with these historical cycles, you have to see inequality decline, and that can either be violent or peaceful. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry if that's a black pill, but
that's Turchin's thesis, the overproduction of the elites. The only way that you can deal with it is you make the elites not so elite anymore. And there's two ways historically that we usually do that. It's with guillotines or financial crashes, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, what we've seen recently is the labor shortage. And I do wonder how much of our stuff with immigration, complete open borders, is due to the labor shortage, where upper class left-leaning Americans want there to be an infinite sponge of immigrants because of the labor shortage. And the thing is, once you have a labor shortage, you can't have a giant stock market, because the stock market is driven by the upper class, and you would need to see an equalization. And I've been really shocked that we haven't had a stock market crash so far. And what we've basically just seen is poverty among everyone else. But because the upper classes are largely doing fine, the stock market continues to function. But I mean, it's what we would see with inflation to prop up the rest of the economy is basically the attacks of the lower classes, because the lower classes are the ones that get hit the hardest by inflation, because they're the ones where if the price of pork goes up 20%, it really hurts them, or if the price of housing. And the reason the price of housing has gone up so fast is because of inflation, because if you have an inflating currency, the housing market is a stable, real asset. And the government can't push that button for much longer until everything falls apart.
Yeah. Sitch, where do you want to go?
So I don't know if you saw, do you know the YouTube channel History Civilis?
I've watched like one or two of his videos.
Yeah, he does like a lot of Roman. He used to, or he does primarily like a lot of videos about Roman history and stuff. And then recently he had a video that I didn't really like, that I seen kind of echo this idea that, you know, we've basically are like that humans today under capitalism are working longer hours and harder and for less, you know, material benefit than both a hunter-gatherer cave people and also like feudal serfs. How do you feel about these ideas?
Yeah, this is one of those things where it's a sampling bias, where the hardness of people's lives is dependent upon very specific conditions to that era of history. And so people ask me, what was life like in the Middle Ages? And I say it's 1,000 years. You got to get more specific. But when people talk about serfs working less than today, they're talking around 1200, which was the equivalent of the 1950s, where quality of life goes through these cycles that are around like 200 years long. And so there were parts of the Middle Ages where people worked not a lot of hours and they were pretty well off. And there were parts of the Roman Empire, but also right before the Black Death, when Europe was really overpopulated and when inequality was super high, people were working multiple jobs and they still couldn't feed themselves. Or there were points in the 1600s where people literally were working themselves to death because the calories they got from working didn't match out to the calories that they could get from. They expended more calories than they could buy. And so that's not really a fair comparison, because these things fluctuate really quickly. And I think your average American works like 12 hours a day, 6 days a week now, or maybe that's too high for average, but that's what I've seen from a lot of people. And that's a really hard work schedule. But even back in the 1950s, people would work 8 hours a day, but also you'd have really long lunches and people would grab drinks like back in the day, people would drink in the afternoons during work. And that's just unimaginable now.
Right.
I read a book on prohibition, and they I mean, I was amazed at how much people used to drink. I mean, they drink all day long at work. It was like kind of crazy.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder how much of that was women entering the workforce because like my entire staff is male and we drink during meetings and it's not a problem.
Nice.
That's hilarious.
Well, I mean, there's a whole idea that like switching from alcohol to coffee and tea like made the Enlightenment happen and all that stuff. But okay, so this kind of idea that people are better off under serfdom, it sounds like you're saying like, well, yeah, there were specific time periods that it was maybe better, but overall, no.
One of my pet peeves is people kind of use capitalism as a proxy for the human condition.
Right.
Well, because the irony is that your economic system doesn't matter that much compared to the supply of labor and productivity. And so even in like incredibly economically repressive systems, if there's not under Russian serfdom in the 1600s, when it was a really underpopulated country, it wasn't that bad to be a serf. But under modern capitalism, which is the most advanced economic condition, if you have bad labor and productivity, you'll live a pretty shitty life. And so and so
what do you mean by it wasn't like, what is the comparison that you're making, I guess?
There are the biggest thing that matters for quality of life is how many people are competing for your job and what your productivity as a person is. So we've increased productivity by 70% since the 1970s, but we've also increased the labor pool 40% more than our productivity would allow. And we've done that through a combination of women entering the workforce, immigration, globalization, automation, and a bunch of other things, and population growth too. And so this is one of my pet peeves that I don't realize when no one else puts together. People complain that people are struggling economically and working longer hours. And then they don't fit. And then they'll also say in the next breath, we need to take more immigration. We need to globalize our economy. And I'm thinking, you don't realize that these are two sides of the same coin. And so there were points where serfdom, you had an easier chance to live a better life. But every economic system goes through a phase where life is really shitty for the average person.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's a good point. That, well, it's weird because I mean, I don't know enough about it because I've always heard from various economic people that essentially the economic policies put forward by the government from like the 40s through the late 70s were very heavily focused on pro-labor.
Yeah.
And then after that, Reagan comes in and basically demolishes that and brings in kind of like neoliberal economic policies. So is it like the policies that were really changing it, or is it just that the labor pool opened up so much because of globalization?
It's hard to say. It's a chicken and egg thing where and what you're saying is true, where post-war period, people were very pro-labor because everyone in the back of their head knew that they had to fight at D-Day or Iwo Jima. And one of the biggest things that Walter Scheidel wrote a book about this, one of the biggest things that collapses inequality is war, because we taxed the rich a tremendous amount during the world wars because there was this shared national mission. And what happened with Reagan was that we had kind of pushed that logic and the economy was in decline. And so we pushed towards less pro-labor positions, but that also coincided with we took an ideology that benefited globalization and the lowering of labor at the same time as we did it. And it's kind of a chicken egg where I don't know which really came first.
Right. Well, it seems like a lot of these it's annoying because it seems like the way these big changes occur in history and in countries is that there's all these forces that are continually trying to pull a country or an ideology or philosophy in a direction always. And that's just the right circumstances kind of happen at one time that allows it to go down that trackway.
I mean, one of my pet peeves is people think countries are designed by their greatest geniuses. Well, the reality is they kind of just happen. And you look over your life, and one of my friends likes to say, predict what you'll do in the next week and then see how much you actually follow that. And people almost never do what they plan over the next week because we're not we're not controlled by the forces that we think. We're not rational beings. We're just controlled by a bunch of different irrational desires inside of us that take turns doing different stuff. And you look back over history, and it's those irrational desires are the ones that are calling the shots, and the policymakers we pick just reflect whatever the public's will is.
Mm-hmm. How do you feel about FDR? He's a very contentious president, depending on who you ask. He's either loved or hated.
I like him a lot.
Oh wow!
I think what he did was, I think the economics of the New Deal were wrong. I don't think he understood economics. I liked that he brought us through a really hard period of our existence, the Great Depression and World War II. And then that's not something I'd want to take for granted. And I don't throw away good leaders when I see them, because history is mostly bad leaders. And I think a lot of what he did was basically just psychological reassurance for the country. And that was what we needed. But I think we could have had a lot worse than FDR.
Mm-hmm. If you buy into generational theory, well, let's say if generational theory is correct, because obviously we're going to see how it plays out here over the next 10 years or so. But if those guys are right, the next president of the United States will be a Lincoln or a FDR, or George Washington. Well, it's maybe a Hitler. I mean, I guess it could be because Hitler was on the German side of the FDR equation. So, I mean, if
Stalin was too.
Yeah. So I guess since you since you said that, like, I don't I can't imagine Biden being the next FDR.
No, I'm from the same town as Biden. We both lived in the town of Centerville, Delaware, which is right in the Pennsylvania border. And the town of Centerville has a diner and a thrift shop, and that's it. It's out in rural Delaware. And Biden lived in a state about a mile outside town.
Right. Mm-hmm. Well, it makes me think this election, like this, if generational theory guys are correct, this election is a lot higher stakes than most people are even aware of.
I don't see any of the candidates being that. I try to never stalk candidates on my show.
You don't think Kamala Harris is going to be the next FDR?
I think she is. I mean, her just raw charisma and ability to understand the struggles of modern Americans.
Look, Trump has already said that he's the next best president to Lincoln. I mean, he's already out there staking his flag, right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things with Trump is just, I'm 22. I'm tired of silent generation people running the country.
Yeah.
Because if we're going to have another Biden versus Trump, that's two people who were basically born during World War II. And I mean, you must have seen the clips with Mitch McConnell or...
oh, yes. Yeah. I'm worried we're going to see that with Biden.
Nancy Pelosi as well. And so we've had two Pennsylvanian presidents in our history, Buchanan and Biden. And the reason for that as a Pennsylvanian is we are the state that has the most cultural similarity with other parts of the country. That if your society is falling apart and you want a candidate to appease as many groups as possible, you pick a Pennsylvanian, because we're close to the South, we're kind of the Midwest, we're kind of the Northeast. And that's why Biden's in power, because Biden can appease different groups inside the Democratic Party. And I can't believe he'd run again, because I don't think he could play a game of guess who. I don't think he could play a game of chess and not pass out, let alone a game of international politics as his society is falling apart. But also, you look at the Democrats, and I don't see them putting up any leaders that could replace him. And another Trump versus Biden, it's like you read other periods of history where a 9-year-old child is on the throne and a bunch of corrupt eunuchs and like mistresses manage the government. That's what it feels like now.
It's exactly what it feels like.
Yeah, I was very shocked for a long time. I didn't think Biden was going to run again. I was like, no, no, no. Maybe I'm curious if he's only running because Trump is running, which is possible. People are making noise now that they think Gavin Newsom is going to be the secret replacement, and that's why he wants to debate DeSantis, which, that could happen, but I just feel like that's also kind of stupid from the Democrats' perspective because of like crime. Like right now, I think
what's his target demographic?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, I think the Republicans kind of screwed themselves with the abortion stuff in terms of electability. But now the Democrats have basically taken advantage of throwing the trash can with crime and immigration. And Gavin Newsom is going to be like the easy focal point to and be like, look how bad crime and immigration is. Gavin Newsom is, especially in California, like Gavin Newsom is like the head of that. So I don't see how he's going to defeat Trump or whomever.
This is kind of a strange point, but I think Gavin Newsom, as an attractive white male, would hurt his position in the Democratic Party today because he is the epitome. I think he's from an upper class background, because the Democrats at this point are so woke that they would really struggle to have an attractive upper class white male as their candidate. And Biden is so old that you kind of like can't look up to him. And so, because remember where the reason they put Kamala in power was because she was a black woman. Right. And that was 4 years ago when our society was still more sane. And it's like, hot take, and this isn't my speciality. It wouldn't surprise me if Michelle Obama takes the lead. But also she's polling really low right now.
You think she's actually going to run?
Didn't she say she wanted to run?
Did she? I know people were making much of noise about it.
I see her in polls, and I'm like, what is this? Why is Michelle Obama in this poll?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. It's a year is a long time.
It is. Yeah.
And we could have a famine in the third world. We could have a war with China. Like a lot of things can happen in a year.
Mm-hmm. It is kind of baffling, and I guess that does speak a lot to wokeness, that people are like urging Michelle Obama to run when it's like, well, what are her qualifications? She's
very likable.
She's likable. She seems like a nice person. She's a lawyer, right?
What qualifications do we even pick for president anymore?
Charisma.
I guess. You could say same thing of Trump, I guess, or Biden's
He's
dying.
Funny.
So
Michelle's not funny.
I
don't know. Do you think do you think wokeness is getting worse or better? Because I feel like people are starting to get fed up with wokeness.
Well, and how do you define wokeness first?
That's a good
for the class.
I define wokeness as an ideology based upon a worldview stemming from oppression with a focus on sex and race. Where it's philosophically structured the exact same as communism, and it also comes from a postmodernist background. And to shorten that, it's basically communism without a concept of truth, which shifted out the working classes for the sexual identities and race.
I agree. I concur.
Yeah, someone in our audience, they titled it intersectional Marxism, which I think is a good way to think about
it's philosophically the exact same structure as Marxism. And what I'd say with wokeness is that it's reached its peak audience, where things often go on curves, where empires normally reach their largest geographic extent after they've already started to go into decline. Companies normally reach their largest market share when the factors that already caused their decline have started to appear. And so for wokeness, I think we've started to see the factors that are going to kill wokeness already going on. And I don't think wokeness is converting anyone new.
What are those factors?
That wokeness just is retarded. It doesn't make it is one of I say this as a person who studied every major philosophy and religion. wokeness is one of the worst designed of all time. I cannot believe that it's real. It's just like and also we built this worst ideology when we had the most information ever. Mm-hmm. Just wokeness is horribly designed because it actively.
So it's designed badly to produce truth or to produce political power. Because I feel like it's designed well to produce political power. I don't think it's designed well to produce truth, and that's kind of the problem. It's designed
to shame a successful, wealthy society with Christian values. I can only exist in a wealthy society from Christian origin because it's built upon a bunch of. If we were in the Middle East or China, the societies that don't care about love, that don't have like love and accepting the meek as their dominant virtues, they just laugh at woke people.
Sure.
And
if they don't have the prohibition on racism that we have, obviously, because that's a giant component. Most people.
If the Nazis won World War II and like race study was still like an academic discipline, we would never have had wokeness.
Right.
But wokeness is horribly designed. Because it shits on its own followers as terrible people. It shits on the majority population as terrible people. It has no mechanization for organization. Standards are bad. And so if you don't have standards, you can't organize people. It thinks reproduction is terrible. It thinks using force is terrible. It doesn't have a concept of it's just wokeness is incapable of doing anything as an ideology. And whenever you look at woke organizations, they immediately fail. And so it kind of weirds me out because I look at Disney or other woke organizations and I think, how do these people survive another 2 years? Because Disney blew itself up in like 2 or 3 years from wokeness. And that's true of most woke organizations. How do the universities survive another couple of years? And it trips me up that I think about 8 to 10% of the population are actually woke, where it's 50-50 right-left. And then most people on the left are kind of normies who don't accept, who just want to help people and who are sympathetic people, or they're sympathetic towards others. And then woke people are like 8 to 10% of the population, and they basically lead the leftist normies behind them.
Aren't all the woke people, like if you look at Turchin's elite aspirant musical chairs game, it seems like the wokeness is a excellent weapon to use in that elite aspirant game. So it seems like the 8% are these elite aspirants that are just using wokeness to eviscerate one another.
Yeah, I have a lot of relatives that are like super hard left, and they're all people who got good college degrees, and then that didn't lead them anywhere.
Right.
And you're seeing with the organizations where they're seizing control and then controlling hiring, so their people get elected. In a lot of cases, because people who don't have, what we did is we over-indexed on credentialism or getting degrees as a way to signify high social, like competency. But the degrees don't actually do that. Where one of the things I found is for hiring people, I've interviewed a couple people from Harvard. They're not good employees because they're too stressed, anxious. They can't adapt to the real world. They're not good team players. And in almost all cases, they're from upper class families that built their entire lives about that. Mm-hmm. And so we over-indexed on credentialism, and then that wasn't actually useful. And so wokeness is a way of, it's a way of bringing credentialism to override merit, because wokeness doesn't have and this is something I get from communism, the left doesn't have a philosophic concept of competency or merit built into any part of their worldview.
Right.
True. Well, and also, I mean, because I agree with you that I think wokeness is not able to replicate power in the long term, because as you kind of what you were saying is, if you're going to try to use guilt as your primary weapon to attack the majority of people in the country, who are white and also that are male, it's like you're basically very few people can use wokeness at the end of the day to keep gaining more and more power. Because if you're white and male, you're kind of setting up the seeds of your own destruction.
Exactly.
So, I don't think that's going to propagate long term.
There's no way to win as well. And this is like, what's his name again? The Scottish guy, the critical drinker. I was listening to one of his podcasts, and he said, it's this strange worldview that tells you that you're a horrible person no matter what you do, and then you're expected to accept it. And it shocked me no one realized this cognitive bug until pretty late, because it was obvious to me ever since I started seeing wokeness. And it's one of my friends likes to say that the left is incapable of thinking over time. And that's really true, where the left predicts emotional reactions, but not real world reactions, where like the left's lack of strategy shocks me, because I grew up playing strategy games. I was addicted to StarCraft, Company of Heroes, Civilization when I was in middle school. And so my brain works that way. And so I'm automatically thinking, what is the next move the other side plays? Right. And the left doesn't do that at all. They're not thinking the incentives they set up with their coalitions, and their worldview is entirely based off logic, emotion. And so the left is good at predicting the emotional states they will entice among their coalition. They're basically just trying to piss off the right as much as possible. But there's no thought about what happens. How do they keep power? How do they keep their people inside their coalition from working with them? How do they keep the other side from killing them? And I just find it astounding, if I'm honest.
Mm-hmm. They do have the one strategy that I find interesting, where they latched on to like George Lakoff and framing for a while, and they were like, look, we can win Republicans over if we just use the right magical words and talk to them in words that they accept as valuable, which
that's
I thought
really woke,
I mean
though. That's like the left, like the
left is the best,
but it is like a strategy that you can see in there, even though it's like, I don't think it's a good strategy. I think it's completely like misplaced, but yeah, exactly. But I do see a kind, like a butt of a strategy there. So
yeah, the left is incredibly good at language. One of my friends, this is his area of study, and he's done a lot of incredible work here, and he calls it GSR, or gossiping, shaming, and rallying. And it's basically the feminine form of aggression, where if girls, it's something women largely use as a way to gain social authority, and it's the political version of Mean Girls. And the left is able to do it because our society lacks a shared moral compass to basically denounce things that we believe are bad. And so the left has made a game of saying that everything is bad and they have a better alternative, but society never asks them what their better alternative is. And that's like, I remember when I was in high school, we had people running for class president, and people were promising all this stuff, like, I'm going to make an ice cream machine, we'll get more vacation days. And all of that was impossible, but the promise was still nice. And so the left's use of language is something that's unparalleled anywhere else in the political spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because, like, so in a video you made, I think it's like your previous couple of videos, you had like the chart where you're like the left, and you had the 10 things that make up the left and 10 things that make up the right. And I broadly agree with everything that you said. And the number one thing at the top was the left believes all humans are perfectible, and the right believes that humans are inherently flawed. And I've always also kind of conceptualized it that way. And that's kind of why, the right tends to look at society and culture as a civilizing factor on humans that are born, sinful or evil. And the left kind of looks at society and culture as a corrupting influence that kind of destroys some perfect human nature. And yet it's weird because, like, with wokeness, and I guess for socialism overall, like, the left has kind of replicated the right, everyone is sinful. They're just putting like what creates the sin in a different area, but it's still this like no-win situation.
Yeah. They have no concept of truth. So this is something I run into with people who aren't on the left, is they expect it to make sense. And I just thrown that out the window. I don't expect anything the left makes sense to. I don't expect anything the left says to make sense. And
I know it doesn't make sense, but it's interesting to see it replicated again. Like, it's kind of like with CRT, they very clearly say like, oh, we're not biological essentialists, but then they just become cultural essentialists.
I mean, it's also that they also are biological essentialists. Like, if you're the whole thing of, if you're white, you can't transfer to being black. Like, your race and your caste determines your position in the left. And I also think that because the left is incapable of acknowledging any. The left today doesn't believe in reality, and I sound like it sounds like I'm making that up, but I took a course in gender studies. I've read a lot of critical theory texts. They think we can make reality whatever you want.
Yeah.
And once you do that, you start to have all these very negative things seep in because you don't have boundaries. And so in your attempt to build a perfect world, you end up with a really bad one because you're not dealing with the world as it exists. And like I like to say that communists promise a utopia, and then the actual reality is that they enslave the working classes. Because if you look at Stalinist Russia, it's just mass slavery, where they feed you enough to survive, and that's it. And the state takes the rest. And for feminism, the end result is that we have the worst female mental health in history, and people don't have kids, and
right.
women have lost relationships that were important to them. And what was your question again? I'm sorry.
Well, no, it was interesting to see this original sin basically replicated by the left. It's funny the way you're describing it. It's almost like the left is treating the physical world like the spirit world, and that's what's leading them down this path.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, another interesting point about this is the difference between why wokeness is such a horrible ideology and why Christianity is a better ideology. Because look, I'm an atheist, so I don't necessarily buy into the Christian philosophy, but I can see that the narrative motivates a lot of people, and it seems like it gets the human psychology right, that humans are flawed and that we need examples in our life to strive to be better. And the left is more like, whatever inner feeling that you have is perfect just exactly the way it is, and you just need to change society to accept that. And I just one philosophy seems to work at a practical level in the real world, and one I don't think works over time at all.
I just made a 50-minute video that I'll hopefully release tomorrow about Christianity's impact on history. And what I'd say is that religions that are successful long-term acknowledge that the world is hard, and then from that, they offer an optimistic vision.
Yes.
Religions that fail offer panaceas that with no effort. And so with Hinduism, Judaism, Confucianism, Buddhism, Christianity, every religion ever that's successful, they acknowledge that life is hard, that we make mistakes, that we're not fully in control of ourselves. And then from that, they offer, if you take, basically explaining it to an atheist, if you take these standards inside of yourself, you will gradually become more like the standards. And the thing with the left, and this is also true of Nazism and Gnosticism and other flash in the pan ideologies that don't last more than a century, is that they offer, if you just agree with us, we will give you heaven on earth. And then what ends up happening is that doesn't occur. And because there is no feedback loop for self-reflection, people externalize that to the rest of the world. And I actually feel sorry for young women today because they have the worst mental health in history. And among Gen Z girls, they're really fried by the mental health and social problems we have today. And the thing is that the cruel thing is that feminism doesn't offer them any real solutions. It tells them that they're perfect and to blame everything on men, or it tells them that they're perfect. But because they're perfect, they psychologically have to blame things on men because that's the only mechanism that exists if you're perfect. But that's in reality a really cruel thing to do because you're not actually offering someone any advice or acknowledging what their lives are really like.
It's kind of the psychological equivalent of domesticating wild animals. Then they're not able to exist anyway in the world. They're just functionally inept.
I mean, if we're being real, the left exists to benefit the managerial class, and because people with college degrees end up being managers. And if you're part of the managerial class, you want people to be as
docile,
domesticated, as hedonistic as possible, because that way they're not going to ask too many questions. And the thing that I would lead back to is, why are the biggest corporations in the world supporting hedonism and also a group that tells them that capitalism and their society is terrible.
Well, those things seem contradictory to me. I understand why they would support hedonism, because there is kind of a hedonistic element to capitalism that makes it work. I mean, capitalism runs on sales.
With the suicidal elements of the left of saying our societies and capitalism is terrible, the reason the big corporations have teamed up with them, in my opinion, is because both the left and these large corporations, their end goal is to give the authorities more power. And this is something that people on the left they never think about. But I remember I was debating Vaush, and I asked him, what are your first policies? And he said, raise taxes. And I said, I thought, you're an anarchist. How is raising taxes your first policy? If you ask people on the left, they want to have the stateless utopia. But the biggest thing before that is we need to give the authorities more power. And so by the time you get to be a mega corporation, I mean, a joke I've heard is that when you start out with your company, you're libertarian. By the time you're a billionaire, you're a communist, because you are the government. And so by pushing the left, they end up giving the authorities more power, and the biggest companies are the authorities.
Mm-hmm. Well, do you think, because when you were talking about earlier about how, most people on the left, they just kind of want to help people. And then there's this 8% of, people that are woke that are kind of taking advantage of that.
They also want to help people, but they've pushed it so far that it's morphed into something evil.
Right, right. And I listen to a lot of boomers who talk about this stuff, who, they're not very involved in internet politics.
Yeah.
And they kind of just perceive wokeness and a lot of this stuff as like the continuation of the civil rights movement. They don't really understand that it's not that it's like the far leftist movement of civil rights. It's not like the MLK liberal movement. And I don't know if the corporations that are kind of replicating wokeness, I'm assuming that they don't realize like the Marxist undertones to what they're doing.
They're in the boomer camp, is what you're saying.
I think it's a combination. And I can't stand boomers with this stuff. And because I was watching Fast Times at Ridgemont High last night, and those that don't know, it's a high school movie set in the 80s. And the thing is, Joe Biden was 40 years old when that came out. And for me, as a 22-year-old, the society of the 1980s was unrecognizable. One of the things that shocks me is no one in Gen Z has social skills. It's funny where I always thought myself as a nerd. I'm a nerd, but I'll run into people that are like chads or attractive girls or anything, and they'll have worse social skills than a lot of nerds I know, because just there is no shared culture. And so like Gen Z has no social skills. No one would be talking to each other at the mall. It's like taboo to pick up girls. Like if a girl's your waitress, it's taboo to like try to hit on her. None of these people in high school, like when I went to high school, no one was messing around or like goofing off or
really.
Yeah, like if you go to Gen Z in high school, it's mostly you do get some crazy parties, and like binge drinking is a big part of Gen Z culture, but it's not like the thing with Gen Z partying is it exists almost as an opiate to cover up how depressing the rest of your life is. So people get completely wasted because they have poor social skills and they're just looking to cut loose. But also comparing the infrastructure 40 years ago, it's the same. Like the house I live in was built in the 70s. It's the same infrastructure. It's just it looks really crappy now. And it was crazy because I lived in LA for a few months to see the stuff that looked filthy when I lived there was the exact same stuff at Fast Times at Ridgemont High, but it looked clean. And I couldn't believe the city looked clean back then. But the thing with the boomers is, like, if you watch even older stuff, like The Twilight Zone, which came out in the 50s, the buildings that look disgusting now they looked absolutely beautiful. And I can't imagine growing up in the 50s and understanding modern America and the country I live in. And because if you grew up in the 50s, Jim Crow was the law of the land in a third of the country. And so for the boomers, I think it's just incredibly difficult for them to understand what life is like. And I'm not going to cut them slack because their lack of empathy is really just not good. It's not okay. And I also think like George Soros. George Soros has got to know what he's doing, and the world that Klaus Schwab got to know what he's doing, and so I think it's a combination of that, and I think a lot of these elites realize that they're on very precarious ground. They just don't understand through what method, and so I think a lot of people on the left pick up that our society is not in a good place, and then they blame it on they externalize that worry to climate change. And so all their worries of their life have been externalized to climate change. And I think the elite has been scrambling, and they're trying to appease the left, partially because there's a lot of left-wing sympathies, but also they see the left as the real dissidents that could wipe them out.
Yeah. I don't know, like when I look at Schwab and Soros, I mean, Soros is so old now, I don't know what's going on with him. But with Schwab, I mean, I just get the sense when I listen to them talking that a lot of these people think they want to build Star Trek. They think that's the future they want to build.
That's such a good way of putting it.
And they just don't understand, like that's where their intuitions are kind of guiding them, but they have no clue how to get there. Because I mean, I think you get the Star Trek through basically capitalism creating the material conditions that allows it to occur, and they're kind of like, no, let's try to get the philosophy first, and then we'll figure out the material conditions. And I'm like, no, I don't think that's how that works.
I also think that there's no comprehension among these like boomer elite types about how easily society can fall apart, and also how far we are. Because you're part of Gen Z, you already kind of live in, I don't want to sound dramatic, you already kind of live in a failed society where Gen Z doesn't, it's so politically split, where one of my friends said, the only thing Gen Z shares is digital induced psychosis. And I mean, I'm from Philadelphia. It was crazy to look at the clips because the areas in Philadelphia that were looted and there's shootings, I would jog there at midnight. I lived in downtown Philadelphia for 5 years, and I never had crime problems. And I don't think these people are aware. And also for like, my best friend's from a working class background, and the neighborhood he grew up in, it's plurality white, and almost everyone they do weed to just get through their jobs. The social community is completely broken down. Almost no people's parents are together or do not have some kind of drug problem. And I think just among like working class normal people, normal society has broken down, and the chances that you get married and have family and that doesn't fall apart, or where you have a normal social community, is just completely dead. I don't think there's any comprehension of that among the people running our society.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree completely. And it's hard for me to conceptualize because I'm older than you. I'm in my 30s, and I was kind of like, I went to school in the 90s and then the 2000s, and we were kind of at like that cutoff range kind of between the 80s, Fast Times at Richmond High, and like, kind of what you're describing now.
Fast Times at Ridgemont High. What are you talking about?
Excuse me. Yes. Okay. Xer. But it's kind of in that like cusp, like between like turning away from that into, I guess, what we're now. And when I went to school, it was like I remember cell phones. I think I was like in like middle school when like cell phones first started to become like a thing that like people could have.
Oh,
and
man.
they're these little crappy. We had those like really terrible Motorola flip phones for a while, and then finally they kind of transformed into those little Nokia like bricks. And I remember. It's so funny. I remember being in 7th grade and we had a substitute teacher, and she was talking about how cool it is she could play Snake on her phone. And that was like the height of technological achievement. And I'm sitting here as like someone who played Game Boy. I'm like, this is the lamest crap ever. And everyone was so enamored with playing Snake. And it's like I can't even imagine now with kids with the smartphones and social media just being on that constantly 24/7, how that just completely changes their reality and how they interact with each other and how they don't have social skills now.
What was a real black pill for me is when I dropped out of school. This is part of the reason I dropped out of school. I apologize for the flex. I was invited to a social club for talented young people. So they basically selected some of the most successful young people across different fields, whether startups or entertainment or influencers. And I met a lot of these people. And so I'm meeting the most successful. And the sad thing is a lot of them didn't like lead good lives. They were like almost all of them had real mental health problems. The most successful guys, very few of them were in relationships. They didn't like trust the people around them. A lot more had money problems than you'd expect. And so it was this real black pill. And also like a lot of my friends back in the day were players and people this is going to sound cringe, you call players and chads. And it was depressing for me to watch because even these guys who were very good with women, they weren't satisfied at all because they weren't able to get into relationships that they found fulfilling. And you can only live the fuckboy lifestyle for a few years at most before you want to shoot yourself. And it was a real black pill to look at the most successful Gen Z people and realize that they had all the same problems that I saw from my hometown or like working class friends I had. And I knew that I think a lot of people hold out this kind of myth that if they try really hard, they can live the perfect life. And I don't think it's a coincidence that you see all these celebrities crash and burn in really horrific ways, like Justin Bieber or Kanye or the various Disney stars or like Demi Lovato. And I just think our society is sick at its core. And I don't think anyone is really winning if you're under the age of 30 or something.
Well, I mean, I think that the maladies that afflict the average youth person, I would categorize as very different than what hits like very successful and famous people. Because I tend to look at it like people's strengths are generally also their greatest weaknesses. So the people that are going to be, the most motivated to get to these like top echelons are also going to have, no life, or they're going to be driven to the point of basically killing themselves.
What I found for both Gen Z across all social classes, from the highest to the lowest, was loneliness. I think loneliness and lack of any sense of purpose were the things that affected people of every social class.
Is it just because of all the internet stuff that everyone doesn't interact in person anymore?
I don't think it's just the internet. Do you know the Mouse Utopia experiments?
Yeah.
I think it's that too, where I think just our society is in social free fall and people are losing the ability to have interpersonal relationships. And I think that it's also everyone feels economic instability where even if you're like a very wealthy CEO who made a successful company, you have to do another successful company after that. And that's a kamikaze strike. And the payout will be less than you expected. And the thing is, if you're in a city like Los Angeles, even if you're making 100K, which is, that puts you in the top 10%, 5% of the population, it'll often be hard to make ends meet with 100K. And the cost of living in major cities means that even if you're incredibly successful, it'll still be expensive to. So I don't think a lot of people who make 100K they could afford to have a stay-at-home wife and kids, which Homer Simpson back in the day could.
Right. It's so weird because I hear everyone say this and it seems to be true. Obviously, everyone feels it, that there's these massive economic problems, massive housing problems.
Yeah.
And I keep seeing people post these charts that show that like the share of wealth and is for like millennials, and I guess Gen Z is usually not on the chart yet, but for millennials is basically on track with the boomers and Gen Xers, and that the housing prices haven't really inflated that much beyond normal inflation. Like, what is it all just like BS? Like, what's happening?
It's incredibly easy to massage numbers if you want to. That's just the best thing to say.
Okay.
And I mean, growing up in Rust Belt, Pennsylvania, I knew we had problems long before Trump. And I completely understand why people voted for Trump, because the Rust Belt is an area with a population larger than Germany, that's bigger than almost any country in Europe geographically. And the Rust Belt got completely hosed by deindustrialization, and no one cared until it wasn't even a topic of discussion until Trump showed up. And Trump was kind of an awakening, because beforehand you had this myth that liberalism would just bring us a utopia. And then we gradually realized that wasn't the case. And it's very easy to massage numbers by not looking at inflation, where one of my buddies runs statistical models for fun. And he found that we've actually entered a really harsh recession since COVID for most people. It's just we don't know how to inflation means we don't have to measure it. Because if you just look at inflation, the numbers are going up. But if you compare for cost of living, it's just horrible. Where the numbers are the worst in Canada, but I mean, rents have gone up some horrific amount over the last 2 or 3 years. In Canada, they've more than doubled, and I think it's a bit less than that in America. And the cost of chicken in Canada also went up like 50% or 100%. And so the prices of basic commodities have been going through the roof. But people will pick what metrics they want. Where, for example, GDP per capita has gone up a lot since the 1970s. And that doesn't account for price inflation, which has gone up a lot more, and especially price inflation for certain necessary things like health or housing. Like, if you just look at housing inflation, your average lower class American puts 3/4 of their income into the housing market. And so if you index price inflation over everything except housing, you're just not going to account for how much housing is killing people.
Right. Let me see. Let me see some questions in the super chat.
Yeah, I hearted a bunch of them if you want. What's that?
You guys doing this live?
We are, yeah.
Sick.
Do you?
Oh, did
yeah, of course.
Did you not know?
You thought we were recording?
My assumption was I talked the same
way.
Look,
the chat's in love with you anyway, so it's not like you're not getting a bunch of. And there's a bunch of super chat questions and stuff like that. We never talked about how long you want to stick around. We've been talking for about an hour and 40 minutes, but I mean, this has been a great conversation. Obviously,
I'm having a lot of fun. I'm down for another hour.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
I just got to run to the bathroom first before we do this.
Yeah, sure. Go to the bathroom.
Go ahead. We'll read a couple super chats that aren't aimed at you.
Guys can gossip about me when I'm gone.
We will.
Definitely.
Okay. PC, thanks so much for the 10 gifted memberships, PC.
Yeah.
I'll ask him about the Taiwan thing, so I'll say that.
We got 10 gifted memberships. Mark Twain's Revenge gifted 20 memberships, which is awesome. We got a 50 gifted memberships here somewhere.
Yeah, I saw Grendel Vat gave us 50 gifted memberships. Thanks so much, Grendel.
Yeah, cool. So awesome. And I think Lucy Lemonbug gifted 5 as well.
Yes, thank you, Lucy. Despite being a dirty chopper.
Welcome new members.
By chopper, I mean sticker.
Right.
Generic
we mean
7.
Chopper.
Generic 7.
Not going to get me again.
For 14 months says late and not gay. S class is S team.
We were pretty close to being on time this time.
We were only like today, 10 minutes late. Yeah.
Everyone, look, Fast Times at Ridgemont High came up, and Fast Times at Ridgemont High was really big when I was like 12 years old. Me and my buddy, we went and snuck into the movie theater to see it. You can't see R-rated movies when you're 12.
Of course. Yeah.
Different time back then, so.
Yeah, it is funny because I am curious now to go back and watch that. Well, I wish I don't know what school is like for Zoomers. I have no clue what it's like. It's got to be so alien to what I would experience. And I'm sure it's even more alien than what you experience.
Look, part of me would go back in a hot second to actually live through it with all the technology and stuff. Because I mean, my childhood was, I wanted to make movies so bad, but they didn't have any way for me to satiate that appetite. Yeah. Right. So if I went back again, like I feel like I'd have a shot at having a film career. Like I'd be like, I would have started making movies when I was 10.
Yeah, but they'd all be terrible, and you'd be competing with 1,000 million other people doing the same thing. So I don't know if it'd be like easier, but you'd feel better because you'd be doing something about it, right?
Maybe. I mean, maybe. It is an interesting dilemma, though. I do. There are obvious problems that young people face, and there are obvious problems that people faced when they didn't have these kind of technologies. So it's a mixed bag.
Yeah. Born Cell for 8 months says Historia Civilis is a YouTube history channel, does a video in ancient Rome. His latest video titled Work, he goes on a socialist rant if you gave it a look. Yeah, we talked about it a little bit earlier, but I don't think we're going to do like a whole breakdown on the stream or anything at any point.
Question does the chat have?
Okay. Well, someone talked about, Philip Coggins brought up we're talking about subs operating the Taiwan Strait. He said the waters are extremely shallow and subs can be seen from the air while submerged. So I know you're talking.
I also don't know why submarine warfare would be useful for that. Submarines tend to operate over large geographic areas where you want to disrupt the enemy's movements. If I think the Chinese's biggest advantage for that is just that they've like murks the hell out of the coastline there, where the Chinese have been constructing bunkers with rockets for the last 60 years, and they've completely dominated that. And so I've heard that I think the Chinese military is actually pretty bad. I stand by that. And so I don't know how effective they'd be, but they have the theoretic potential to deny any American ships in the Taiwan Strait. And I don't think submarines would be that strategically useful.
Do you think
Oh, go ahead.
What were you going to say, Adam?
Well, I hearted the ones that are direct questions to him just to help you out,
not?
But go ahead.
But do you think that China would have a good chance at taking over Taiwan? Or will be like Russia, Ukraine?
It's funny where it could go either way, and I don't know, but it's basically impossible to find a country with a good civilian bureaucracy and a bad military, or vice versa, where you can use like your nation's ability to just get crap done inside itself through bureaucracy to its military. And so I think the Chinese would do really poorly because they have no background. They haven't fought a war since 1971, and then they failed in that war and the war before. But you look at the Chinese endeavors to do everything else, where they're saving up food and iron and stuff for their potential problems through dealing with COVID, through their lockdowns. And the Chinese have just been behaving in a very schizophrenic, poorly managed, just bad way. And so I think their military would probably be similar, where because this is actually interesting, where all of China's previous invasions since like the last 500 years have failed for the same reason. The Chinese get a bunch of guys, they launch them forward, and then they don't train them, they don't do logistics right, and then they just get slaughtered by a much smaller native population. And this happened in Burma in the 18th century. It happened in Mongolia in the 1500s. It happened with Korea in the 1950s. And so I think that would be what would happen, where the Chinese would just not get the logistics right, have a bunch of guys die. And also the thing with Taiwan is it's a fortress island where the cliffs are 1,000 miles, there's not 1,000 feet tall, and it's jungle. And so amphibious invasions are incredibly difficult to pull off, and only the most advanced militaries in the world can do it. And so part of me thinks like, China is the geographic size of the United States and is 4 times the population. And Taiwan's the size of Ireland. So imagine if there was like an Ireland off the coast of South Carolina and the US failed to conquer that.
Embarrassing.
That would be pretty embarrassing. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Especially because, China does have an air force and stuff like that. So
they do.
They don't have to scale those walls, right? They just fly over there.
Air Force doesn't really do much. I mean, if you look over history, you've never been able to use an Air Force to win an on-the-ground conflict where, the Vietnam War is the greatest example. The U.S. dropped more just bombs on North Vietnam, which was a third world pre-industrial society, than the entirety of World War II combined. And we didn't do a dent in the Vietnamese.
Jeez.
Because they have trouble dropping a bunch of people in there. Paratroopers are bad because there's no supply line.
There's not enough of them. It's just you can't launch an offensive campaign like that. And also, like if you just drop infantry, they'll get slaughtered by tanks.
Right.
And one of the things I've learned reading enough history is humans can be like cockroaches, where you can besiege a city for years, drop bombs in it every single day, every hour, and then somehow like 40% of the population survives. This is one of the things from World War I, where in World War I, they drop ungodly amounts of artillery on like a single mile of area for a week, and then somehow a majority of the people survive.
Look, because you figure it out. You're like, look, I need a bunker quick. You're digging a hole and putting cement on the top of it.
And when shit hits the fan, people will really struggle hard to survive.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thoughts Apprentice, thanks so much for 6 months. Says, I don't agree with everything Rudyard says, but I appreciate his historical analysis, even as a lefty. P.S. Rags mentioned Lion King 1.5. Did you DM him? I did not. No.
Thank you. Was there a question there?
There wasn't, no.
Just a compliment.
Nax last for 18 months says, I'm very interested in hearing about how the far left are invested in purity. I would have thought they didn't tolerate dissent, not impurity.
Okay, yeah. So purity, according to John Haidt, is what values do you hold sacred? And it's very closely related to disgust, where if someone's very high in disgust, they'll also be very high in purity. Where, for example, with a woke person, they wouldn't want to go on a camping trip where they'd have to see their friends naked and go through dirt and all that stuff in the same way like a religious fundamentalist wouldn't be comfortable with that. Or they wouldn't. People who are high in purity also don't like taking rotting food out of the fridge.
Right.
It's the same psychological, physiological force. And we don't notice. Every society has to have purity to differing degrees. In too much, it becomes like a strangling force, and too little, you fall into decadence. And we don't notice the far left's purity because it's not in normal ways. If you're part of a traditional religion, you would have purity associated with sex or with not taking the Lord's name in vain or for following the right rituals. For the left, it relates to word usage and language, where, for example, as a person who's basically a libertarian, if I ran an organization and a communist came to speak, I wouldn't have a problem with that. If you're on the far left and Jordan Peterson speaks in your college, he is defiling the purity of the organization with his alternate views. Mm-hmm. If you're on the left, and this is why they get triggered so easily, because their purity threshold is so unbelievably high or so unbelievably low, where, like for me, I get called all the most horrible things every day on YouTube, but it's part of the job. If for the left, their purity comes through basically extreme emotional reactions to things that will not endanger their lives.
Has Haidt redone his moral foundations test on woke people? Because I know classically, because I know like pre-woke
done that
stuff.
For the coddling of the American mind, where because when Haidt was writing that in probably 2016, I guess, when he wrote The Righteous Mind. Wokeness
2012 was Righteous Mind.
Okay.
See, I did change my life. I was like, holy cow.
Yeah. Wokeness hadn't really reached its form. And it's funny where I've got some like hippie-like tendencies. I have a collection of hippie shirts. Like I'm interested in the spirit world, and I can get kind of woo-woo at times, where that would be a very left-wing trait 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And now on the left, like you see a lot of people like Joe Rogan or Russell Brand. If those people are on the right, that means the left has gotten very stringent and very fundamentalist. And it's funny to see that switch occur, because back in the day, if you lived in Portland, Oregon, you would be able to live whatever life you wanted and people wouldn't judge you. And now, if you want to do that, you move to a red state. And so you've seen the purity axes flip, where the left took on a lot of traits that you used to just see in religious fanatics.
Yeah, because I know like classically the left had very little care for purity at all in his original stuff. So I'm wondering if like what we're seeing with woke, is it really a disgust that's manifesting, or is it something different? It's just this dissent that's not being tolerated.
The left offers. I know a lot of people who are incredibly woke, and I know it's on a visceral biological level, because if something bad happens, they'll burst into tears or they'll ruin their week. And that's not something you fake. And the left kind of just offers, it tells people whatever they want to hear to get power. And you see this with communism, offer utopia. The second they do get power, they enslave the populace and kill millions of people.
Right.
And I'm going to quote the Unabomber here, because I think he has got the correct analysis, that the left is a reaction to how atomizing and alienating modernity is. Because back in the day, you'd live in a village, everyone in the village knew you, you may have had a hard life, but at least you felt like you were a person and you had your own little plot of land that you managed as a business with your wife. And now you work at a giant mega corporation. And if you look at the left's top demographics, and what Kaczynski, the Unabomber, said was that this caused a lot of feelings of repression and alienation, because if you're dealing with all these impure personal bureaucracies, you're not allowed to express who you are as an individual. But if you're in a village with everyone knows you since childhood, you can be yourself. And if you look at the left, their dominant things they talk about are repression, powerlessness, and resentment. And that would make sense for a bunch of people who feel like they're cogs in the machine. And what you would also see with a worldview built off that is a anger at standards and controlling yourself. So they would offer everything. And then once they get power, they turn it into basically an ego trip where they get total power over everything. And the left is powered off everyone wanting to be the dictator with total power, which is why they don't structure. The left doesn't have any structures for once it gets into power because everyone wants to be the dictator.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that, though I do think, especially kind of like with Uncle Ted and stuff of that nature, there's a lot of grass is greener going on there. Because like if you live in a small town and everyone knows you, or small village, everyone knows you,
yeah,
that can be just as stifling, because then it's like the authenticity of the individual can completely be annihilated because everything becomes like, well, everyone knows who you are. You have no anonymity to do anything. Everything you do is a reflection of your family. Everything becomes very much, about the family name and everything. So it's like a different type of stifling of your individuality.
I mean, I agree with you I agree with Uncle Ted. I'm allowed to say that. I agree with the Unabombers.
Uncle Ted now? You guys are calling him? What are you, crazy?
I agree.
I do not support the Unabomber in any fashion.
Yeah, I also do not support the Unabomber in any fashion. But
the Luddite challenge, I mean, is pretty interesting. But go ahead.
His assessment of the problems with modernity is correct. I think his idea we need to revert to monkey is wrong because it's you can't go back. The advantages conferred by industrialization are so massive, and people tend to go to conclusions, and I jump to radical conclusions. And I think realistically, you can warp modernity over time to not have the problems he talks about. And what I'd say is that what you're describing is incredibly collectivist, and it's stifling. But it lasted for thousands of years, and our system's falling apart after a century. And the West, and especially the English-speaking countries, are able to break out of that, where if you're in 1600s England or early America, you live in this very rural, personal society, but also you've broken down the clan and you have capitalism. So you would know the people in your life, but also there is an expectation you'd move out of your town and have social mobility. And I've said in loads of videos that the breakdown of the clan and the rise of individualism is the biggest thing that resulted in the West's dominance and later stuff like the Industrial Revolution or the Scientific Revolution or the modern world.
Yeah, I just think it's kind of like what you were saying earlier, where talking about like the medieval period is like this massive period, and history goes through this kind of ebb and flow of people being in a good spot and then people being in a bad spot under similar systems, similar economic systems, similar cultural systems. And I feel like, everyone kind of does this. Like they'll just, sample bias, point to all the good parts of some system they like, ignore all the bad parts and say, see, everyone was happier back then. And I'm always just eternally skeptical. I'm like, I'm pretty sure there's lots of horrible stuff going on back then.
I try really hard to not glorify the past because it was hard. And I live in Texas right now, and I would not live here even 100 years ago because of malaria and the heat.
And AC, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, if I wanted to, I could grab a flight to Paris tonight. That's insane. I could be there tomorrow morning. And so we have a lot to be thankful for. And I kind of view history as cycling between tolerable and intolerable, where when I went to high school, I was like, I didn't have any spending money. I was working really hard, but my life felt tolerable. I had a lot of friends. I was happy. And objectively, I might live you could be objectively a millionaire with a beautiful wife who's famous, but your life is intolerable for other reasons. And I don't care what those other reasons are. What matters is that it's intolerable to you. Right. You could be a peasant in northern India and you're happy because you just like your life a lot. And history goes through these cycles of tolerable and intolerable. And when things get and it's for a bunch of reasons, whether economic, family, just you have a lot of freedom, And it doesn't really matter what the reasons are. What matters is the outcome of, are people happy? And we're in a system where we may have a lot of material advances, but our society is falling apart due to mental health issues. And so I judge we have a lot going for us, but we're intolerable in the same way that like Europe before the Black Death was intolerable, or Rome before it fell was intolerable.
Right. It seems like throughout history, there have been times where there's been societal collapse, like societies have just ceased to exist. I don't know if that can possibly happen now that the world is so interconnected, because
it makes it easier, actually.
Okay,
there's a thing called complexity theory, and it stems from the study of the Bronze Age collapse, where most people have never heard of it, but the Bronze Age collapse was something that happened around 3,000 years ago, where over a matter of 50 years, the entire Bronze Age world fell apart.
Did they lose technology? What happened? What did it look like?
We don't really know. Like, all the smartest people have tried to study this. We don't have a good answer. And it could be barbarian invasion, climate change, social change. The best answer I would have is that the Bronze Age, and we invented complexity theory as an outgrowth. It's funny that we don't think about it because it was 3,000 years ago, but the Bronze Age world was incredibly globalized and was dependent upon getting resources from really far away. And so you would get tin shipped into the Middle East to make bronze from the British Isles or from Afghanistan. And the tin trade and all these exotic resources was spanning the entire world 3,000 years ago. And so what ended up happening was that once you knocked out one part of the trade node, everything else fell apart. So once barbarians knock out the Hittites or the Mycenaeans, the entire rest of the Bronze Age world collapsed. And also, there was a technological shift where the governments of that era were really repressive, and there was a shift away from basically a democratization of weapons. And so the peasants were thinking to themselves, why do we need the government anymore? They just tax us. And so it was a breakdown in people feeling like they needed government. And with globalization, I don't know if we'll have a social breakdown. We're a pretty advanced society, but we're in a similar place where there are so many interconnected pieces. And this is something I really admire Peter Zeihan's research. Where did you know that the third world is completely dependent upon grain from Russia and Ukraine? So if those countries have a civil war, hundreds of millions of people will starve in Africa and the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
Or we're dependent upon the chips in our phone are mined in the Congo, one of the most unstable areas. And then the chips, the subcomponents for the chips, and the chips themselves can only be made in Taiwan, also a really strategically weird area, or oil. And so if Peter Zeihan talks that if one node of global trade falls out, the system collapses. And I don't know if that's going to happen, but it's definitely possible.
We'll find out. Wolfie for $10 says, hello, Alt His, been watching your videos for many years now. Very good videos with a breadth of good information. I mean this in no offensive way, but you speak like you're always giving a presentation.
Maybe I am. Maybe that's just what my subconscious is.
There you go.
Video essays are kind of a presentation anyway. So.
Of course.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Do you have a take on the idea that one day robots or AI will actually displace humanity?
So AI is not my area of speciality, and I'm very careful to not walk into areas that I haven't studied super hard, because having looked into history really deeply, the difference in your comprehension of everything between on one side of the Dunning-Kruger is massive. And so I know, like, for climate change or AI, I'm in a position where I don't know what's going on. What I'd say is I think that if AI got too bad, we just have a revolution, because the end point of AI is massively increasing inequality. And so if we increase inequality more, I think we'd have a revolution. And I also think I think for a lot of people, AI is the revelation for nerds, where the singularity or history ends, I think that's foolish. And people are always want to say the world's ending, and it never does.
Right.
But on top of that, I also think AI is incapable of doing everything we think it is due to a philosophic bug in modernity, where AI can't interact with the real world. Its information is purely based off the data sets we give it and off the assumption that's going to producing it. And so in the same way, every side of the political spectrum went through a phase of saying that they were the scientific truth. Once we make AIs, I think that they'll just become reflections of the worldviews of the people that make them. And they won't be able to like tell us, is there a God? Or how do I live a happy life? Or how do I run the economy? Or how do I win wars? I don't think they'll be capable of operating on that level. I have a friend, I think what they can do, and I'll use an example. I have a friend that uses AI to look at people's faces and then determine how their personalities and look at their body language and use that to determine how their personalities work. Because there's data on people's personalities compared to their body language that you can do that. And it's scarily accurate. And I mean, Turchin also used AI to figure out when societies have civil wars. And so the top thing AI would do would be to wipe out a class of white collar workers, which they kind of run society. So I'd imagine that they'd react poorly to that. And it would also, I could also, as a positive, see it speeding up research really quickly.
Do you think that we will, like, just philosophically, is it possible to create an artificial human, like a robot that is sentient?
I don't think so. I think it's too complicated, because if we've learned anything from science, it's that everything is much, much more complicated than we give it credit for. And what we've found in every field of science is once you get past a certain length, it's just chaos you can't predict. The subconscious past a certain point is chaos. Physics past a certain point is chaos. History set past a certain point is chaos. And we've studied physics and we can't predict where particles go. And so I think we would never be able to recreate the human race with robots, because too many factors that just went into the creation of us can't be replicated in the lab.
Do you understand the Chat GPT technology? Have you looked into that at all?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so Chat GPT basically takes these large language data sets and it's only trying to predict the next best guess for what word goes next. So it's a completely different way of thinking. And ever since I figured out how it worked, I start thinking about my own thinking and wondering how close it is to actual human thought. Like, are humans thinking in these large blocks of concepts, or are most humans just thinking what next logical word goes here?
I think people's subconsciouses are infinitely deep, and things are going on in multiple calculations at the same time. And people have different personalities inside of them that are jockeying for influence. And so,
the reason that I bring it up is just because of the complexity thing. If there's two ways that it could go, either humans are far more complicated than Chat GPT, or they're as simple as Chat GPT, and we just have this idea that it's complicated, but really it's just
I think very simple
imitation. It's like Andrew Jackson had a
Sitch is already rebelling at the idea.
I think humans are way more complicated than Chat GPT. I mean,
maybe just obviously humans have two different operating systems here. They have they have the emotional, and then they have the logical, rational language part of the brain built on top of that. Maybe just the language part of the brain works like ChatGPT. But ChatGPT obviously doesn't have all of the emotional.
First of all, defining what sentience is very complicated in the first place. Like, how do you define when a robot has gained sentience in the first place? Because I think it's possible that we could create. I think it's possible we could create, data or something like that at some point, but you would never really know, is this something that's sentient and has consciousness and deserves rights? Or is it something that's simply just acting the way that we've programmed it to act, and it's really just a toaster that looks like nice and says nice things? I don't think we'll ever be able to really make that determination.
I don't know
how we could.
We're going to have to as a society.
We're going to have to, but I don't know how we can. Like, I don't think we can replicate humans, but I think we can make something like a data in the future.
Go ahead, Roger.
It's much easier to replicate the external forms of things than the internal ones.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, like, it makes me think of Andrew Jackson had a parrot that would speak full sentences, and the parrot had no clue what it was doing.
Give that parrot rights. I mean, I'm for it.
Yeah. But what I've found with my study of anthropology is people are much more deeper and irrational than we have any comprehension of. And people also think in very different ways, where men and women think differently, people of different cultures think differently. Just random people, I'm sure all of us, if you did a Myers-Briggs, we'd come out different. And that informs our life in a bunch of ways. And I think AI will become a reflection of the California data nerds who built it rather than the human race. And we'll end up seeing it will be useful for a couple things, but it will be there's a theory that consciousness is dependent upon individuality or your existence, because you can't think about something unless you're in a certain space where you have to grow up and experience the world, because once you think about something, you're thinking how to get something and how to live your life. And that's dependent upon having an actual life. And so I've heard it's impossible for a computer to be able to think in the same way as a human, because life is so wildly different from a human.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, this is how they're training the various robots, because they're training them on data sets. It's just real world interaction between the robot and whatever task.
Yeah, but what's motivating the robot and guiding the robot is so vastly different than what motivates and guides a human.
Because, I mean,
is it?
Of course.
Let's be real. The motivation for guys to dress well is 70% getting laid.
Yes, that's look. You're making my point here.
Robots aren't trying to get laid.
Look, they tell the robot, get the soccer ball in the.
And look at what happens 5 years down the road.
Yeah,
men will be living in absolute filth. You just remove the incentive structure, and your entire society changes. Yeah. The robot doesn't have the incentive to get laid or be liked or find.
Why not? You just program it in.
I don't know what to tell you.
You're like, there's women here. Look, get dates with these women.
Okay. Hello, I am Omnitron 3000. You are Stacy number 3112. What would you like for dinner?
Look.
Pick
you
up
know,
320.
You know that robot would be getting a date 7 nights a week, like in just a matter of time.
I mean, what's it look like? Anyway, let's move on from the robots. Luke W. for Format says, if any of the stuff is real regarding CIA spirit world stuff, how come nobody has been able to claim the James Randi $1 Million Challenge?
What is that?
That's a good point.
So James Randi was a famous skeptic and magician, I believe, who he basically supposedly offered $1 million to any psychic that could prove that they were psychic through some scientific rigor or something.
This is one of those things that gets kind of weird, but we've had physics experiments where literally particles move differently whether or not you're looking at them.
Right.
And that sounds fake, but it's actually true, where we've run it where if you have a camera looking at something, particles move differently than if it's not. And that strangely corresponds to the ancient philosophy and medieval philosophy that thought they believed that consciousness created reality,
right?
Which I don't know how to explain that, but and it's one of those things where, again, I'm throwing out theories I don't know if are true or not, but there are certain things that can't be measured, and they can't be measured scientifically, like love. Love happens. If we were in a certain autistic enough society, we could say that love didn't exist because we didn't replicate it under scientific conditions.
Right. Or we experience it. That's the only way to know. Yeah.
Exactly. Right. Or, for example, we do this a lot with my field, where people say we will never have a major war or political crisis because the West hasn't had one since 1950. And I'm thinking, you're using like a bad scientific model where since 1950 is your scientific study, and then everything outside of that doesn't exist. And I'm not sure that that's the correct way. Because imagine you are a psychic and you say that someone you love will have a problem in the next month. And then your grandmother realizes she has cancer 2 weeks later. How do you measure that?
Right. Do you know about the Baxter experiments with
No, I don't.
with the plants and the lie detectors?
Oh, no, please tell.
There's like, this is so frustrating. There's a guy who basically created the lie detector on a whim. He hooked up the lie detectors to I forget what kind of plant it was, some plants. And he thought like, oh, I'm going to water these plants and maybe the lie detector will like measure the electroactivity of the water, like going up the stem of the plant. And the thing that he noticed was really weird was that before he started to water the plant, like as he's like leaning in to do it, it started registering on the lie detector. And then he started to think, oh, like maybe the plants have some way of detecting when moisture is near or something, like it's preparing.
Yeah.
But then it was even weird. So then he started doing stuff where he wouldn't actually have water. He would just visualize in his mind that he was going to water the plant. And apparently that would register on the plant. And then he would also say like, oh, well, I'm going to like attack the plant with fire or something. And then that would register on the plant. And then he'd just think about attacking the plant with fire. And and he'd always like really wacky experiments to just see what the plants would react to this. And I'm reading this. I'm like, how has this not been like either debunked by like people replicating this and failing to get the results or, or saying that it's true. And there's actually, it's hilarious. There was a Mythbusters where they tried to replicate this and they actually did. And they still like said like, oh,
no way.
Like, yeah, well, it's funny because they're like, oh, well, we replicated. We were like attacking the plants, thinking about attacking the plants and it registered. However, after a time of thinking about attacking the plants, it stopped registering. Therefore, it's not scientifically valid or it's not repeatable. So it's not science. Even though that was literally part of Baxter's experiment was he would say, oh, if I kept threatening them in my mind, but not going through with it, they'd stop registering it. And so I don't understand like why people aren't trying to replicate these experiments.
The philosophic jumps I've made that I'm shocked few other people have is I've come to the conclusion that human societies and everything is alive. When I look at a country, I see a country as a living, breathing organism. And I see history as a living process because everyone involved is living. And I see countries take on a lot of the psychological aspects of individuals. Like countries can go crazy like individuals. They can go through happy phases. And a lot of our problems in modernity stem from us treating things that are living as if they're machines. Where I remember when I went to school, I would wake up at 5:30 every morning to go to school. And that made sense for their autistic bus schedule. But what you're actually doing is creating a miserable experience where the kids don't learn. And so we treat people like they're cogs rather than individuals. And with that, it makes sense from a living person's perspective, where if I hear a giant T-Rex roar outside my house, I will be scared until it happens 5 times over. My neighbors tell me it's just a boombox and I shouldn't be afraid, then I'll stop being scared because living things interact with their environments. And so once the plants realize they're not going to be threatened, it stops being a scary thing.
Right.
And I mean, the reason beforehand is that no one has an incentive to push it. Traditional religious authorities, they would lose a lot of their power if you had to open up a whole new can of worms. Academia bases its power off a materialist world. Government authorities, like I read an interesting book, The Secular Age by Charles Taylor, and he made 2 really interesting points. I mean, there's the obvious point that religion went into decline due to technological progress, but he also said that religion went into decline because religious authorities became buzzkills, and it was also easier for national governments to control their populations without religion, because you could just make it straight. Nationalism is your new religion.
Have you read Donald Hoffman? Do you know about his research? No. Oh, you got to check him out. We'll have to exchange a bunch of book ideas after the stream. Yeah.
Jay for $20 says the right has the military. He must not be talking about the U.S. military. Yeah, people say the military is woke now.
It's different things. So that this actually happened in the Russian Revolution and the French Revolution. Enlisted men and the officers tilt right. Most of the left are ethnic minorities inside the military who are not woke. And then the government makes political appointments for the highest level of the military. And I have some friends who are attached to that, and they're actually using Me Too, they're using Me Too to basically remove the top brass level of the military, even if it doesn't make any sense. And what's happened in the French Revolution and the Russian Civil War was that when shit hits the fan, men side with their colonels and their officers rather than the admirals or generals,
Right.
because they see those men as identifiable to them, while they see the top level brass as political appointments.
True. And Jay for another $20. Thank you, Jay. Says, quote, the left baits the right into doing something stupid. Christian nationalism has entered the chat. Yeah, that's James Lindsay's perspective, and I definitely could see that happening.
Yeah, I just wish the right would cool it for a couple of years until, like, in so many videos I've told the right not to launch a revolution because that's the only way.
Yeah.
No one's driving the ship, though. I feel like it's gonna.
That's the problem. The mob psychology is the worst aspects of individual psychology.
Yep.
Yeah, and it always presents itself at the worst possible time.
Yeah, and there's a mob, and then there's the people that basically rise to the top by just listening to the mob and giving them whatever they want to hear.
Ibram Kendi is not a real intellectual. The reason he's worth $50 million is he gave the mob what he wanted. And Donald Trump, our glorious God Emperor, he's like, I don't see him as a realpolitik, political mastermind. He's giving the crowd what it wants. And you look at this last election, he didn't launch a revolution, but he said a lot of stuff that was proxy to it. And I do wonder if stuff gets worse, especially if he gets indicted. Does he just YOLO it?
I don't know. I mean, we were talking about Civil War stuff, and I mean, you were talking about this on a previous stream, Adam. I do think something that would lead us down a bad pathway is that if Trump gets elected and he puts in some stooge for attorney general, and they literally just start arresting Obama, Biden, Hillary, like everyone they can.
Yeah, see, look, there's a million of these things that could happen that are just unprecedented. Yeah. You mentioned Trump, and people are going to want to know if you support Trump or if you're agnostic or what's your position.
I don't publicly state political positions online.
It's probably the best.
Well, you said, look, the only reason I'm asking is because you said Trump, our God Emperor, and people will take that.
Oh, I was saying that ironically.
It was obviously, but people, if it's ambiguous, people will take it to mean that whatever they want it to mean.
Let it be ambiguous.
I think he is not a good person. I think several of his policies were good.
Right.
Okay. I feel like that's every politician.
Yeah.
I'm amazed at. There's 3 policies that I can think of that just seem to be policies that walked into his office and he ended up like making a concerted effort to get them passed and passing them in each case. There's the prison reform, which Kanye and his wife brought to him. There is the healthcare price reform thing that I don't know how he got in contact with that, but I read this guy's book, and it's this idea that, we need to reform healthcare by actually putting prices on things, and Trump passed an executive order to do it, and it's still working its way. And he saw Christopher Rufo on Fox News and did a complete CRT ban. It's like, so many people talk about, look, nothing is happening in Congress. And here's 3 things where people just walked into his office with a good idea and he implemented them.
What I saw was he basically limited the American labor pool, where the 5 years after Trump were the highest gains in the lowest level of labor since the 60s. And he did that through a combination of tariffs and cutting off immigration. And so, Trump rapidly reindustrialized America, where America except for immigration, Biden's kept these policies, where America has seen exceptionally rapid reindustrialization, starting with Trump. And also Trump was the first president to go against China, where the Obama administration did basically nothing against China, which really shocked me at the time. And so I think
that's a good one. He basically took the conflict with North Korea off the table too, just by being friendly with Kim Jong-un.
Yeah. Let's see. Josh for $5 says Biden will end the war right before the election and say vote for me, end of the war. I mean, well, first of all, I don't know. I don't think it's up to Biden to just say I'm going to end the war in Russia and Ukraine. And even I don't know if Putin would want to give Biden. Why would he want to give Biden a win that close to the election anyway?
It's just, Biden can't end the war. It's out of his control.
Thank you. Tell them, Rudyard.
It's so annoying. I hear
it's also like I see this weird obsession. I move my cards out. I support America and Ukraine because I support weakening the Russians because they're our rival. And that's
strategically apt, right?
But I mean, we're seeing our top rival basically bloody themselves without us having to have a war with them.
Well, yeah, and if they took Ukraine easy, the chances of them invading a NATO country become much higher, and then we actually
Taiwan or something else. Yeah.
Then we actually do have to put boots on the ground. We're trying to stay out of the war.
I think people saying that like we're spending $500 billion and like not protecting the border, that's true. But also one right doesn't equal, that's like a whataboutism where we should be doing all those things. We should be helping the American middle class, but you can't have your 3-course meal all the time you want. And it's also people act like there's people just have too many emotions and they should just go home and meditate and watch TV. Actually, I don't want to say that. I don't want to throw all of the problems destroying our society under the bus, but also you can solve them without going absolutely crazy. There was a poll that came out when the Ukraine war started saying that a majority of left-leaning young Americans wanted to have a war with Ukraine. And people were calling me right when the war started saying, why don't we fight Ukraine? And I'm saying, this country's never been our ally. They had a chance to join and they didn't. And we're already like a third of the world under our protection. We don't need to add more to that. And also there's this I think people need to cool their emotions with Ukraine because both the right and the left make really they treat Ukraine like it's Canada, like it's something that's incredibly close. And the fate of our nation is decided by it. But the reality is it's a second-rate proxy that we're not an ally with.
Yeah. But we have a lot of money tied up there that we want back.
Yeah. I mean, war is like the trash. What's the thing you put in the sink where the trash eats it?
Garbage disposal?
Yeah, war's like the garbage disposal. Anything you go there gets chewed up and you never see it again.
Right. But yeah, I just get annoyed when I hear people like both on the left and the right who act like there's some magical thing that Biden can do to just be like the war ends and Russia and Ukraine shake hands. I mean, like the war would end if we just stop supporting them and then Ukraine.
I mean, also,
but they act like they can just he can just wave his hand and then they'll come to some magic agreement.
That doesn't end the war. Like if we stop supporting them and it emboldens Putin to enter a NATO country, we're back in the war again. Like it still doesn't end the war.
Yeah, but that's not what they think is going to happen.
It reminds me of when Trump was running for office and he was running off an isolationist platform where he said, we don't want to support Europe or the Far East. And he was also saying, we need to use the US military to destroy ISIS. I'm thinking, this is a play because by the Trump administration, America was an oil exporter. We didn't need the Middle East at all. And I was thinking, why does the US military need to put its boots on the ground in this place thousands of miles away from America? And it's just we're an incredibly emotional society and choices aren't made over rational decisions. It's virtue signaling inside your own group.
You got to read Dictator's Handbook, man. You will love it.
Yeah.
It's made me kind of cynical how easy it is to manipulate people based off their emotions in politics. Where I think about a lot of these issues, how many of these things are real issues because they're actually people care, and how much because they had a button pushed. Where I look at people talking about like why is the COVID lab leak or why is calling it like the Kung flu? Why is that controversial in our society? And like I look at that because it's nothing to do with America. It's China. It's their problem. The right and the left, I don't see why they're supposed to care. And I just imagine for those things, like the Communist Party paid someone in the US media. They made it controversial and we're so polarized that it became a sticking point because we wanted them to fight over.
Yeah, it's sad because it's so much of it's all just dictated by tribalism, and I think the Ukraine situation is such a good example of that. Because I mean, I bring this up all the time. It's like in the debate between Obama and Mitt Romney, Mitt Romney says like Russia's the number one threat we have to watch out for. Obama laughs in his face, tells him the Cold War is over. Like, and it used to be that was like the right wing position. Gotta watch out for Russia. Yeah. And then during Obama's, like 2 years later, Russia invades Ukraine, takes Crimea, and then since Obama's like, the Republican strategy at that moment was we can't support Obama in anything. So then when Obama starts supporting, kind of moving against Russia, the Republicans are in this weird spot. They're like, well, even though this was our position for like 30 years, we can't really necessarily support Obama. And then it's like all this stuff with Hillary's emails and Russia and Trump and like all that stuff just creates this narrative that feeds people down this pathway of how they feel about Russia and Ukraine, as opposed to like whatever's actually happening.
What I've seen as well is what's the example? COVID vaccines. The Trump administration developed the COVID vaccine.
Yes, yeah.
The left hated them. The left got the vaccine and then made it their biggest issue. Or like the Robert Mueller case was a total meme because the left's view on him flip-flopped like 4 times, depending on the moment. And it's like, I've come to the conclusion, no one has lives, because if you have a life where you're taking care of your family and you have a job you like and you're watching a new, like one of the things that really gets me, and this is a bit of a tangent, is we don't have new music or movies. Like our society is that broken. And so people focus on politics because they just need something to do.
Right. No, I think that's a good point. And even worse than Mueller, I think, was Comey, because it was like the flip-flop on Comey was insane, because at first the left was like, oh my God, Comey came out and he totally ruined Hillary's ability to win the election. And then it's like, oh, Comey's a hero. He stood up to Donald Trump. Like, it's just like make up your mind.
And like, I'll see figures like Shu on Head, where Shu on Head she's a socialist. And then the left's totally dejected her for a handful of opinions. And it's all like that, where it's just complete. And I purposely, I think part of the reason I haven't gotten canceled is because I try not, there's a handful of issues I try to not touch. Like I'll never talk about COVID. I'll never talk about the 2020 election because I can keep my audience and talk about interesting topics. And if I can make a video talking about historical cycles and what that means for the next 20 years, the public, that's just like, someone once joked, the reason you haven't been canceled, Rudyard, is that would involve the mob listening to your videos for longer than 10 minutes.
There you go. That's true.
Very true.
You need a clip. Mithram 6 for 500 Kazarks. Thank you. Says the U.S. was built on the idea that people with different values can live side by side, but now the government grew so much it's being regularly used to impose values on one group or the other. This zero-sum situation is what's driving the polarization.
I mean, I think a bunch of things drive polarization. I definitely agree with what he said, and I've said that in my videos, where the U.S. was designed as a very libertarian society, where like the South back in the day, and this is still true. We don't want to say it. The South, the middle states in New England were like completely different societies. And so we built the country around how do we tolerate these very different people living together? And then over time, the government and the bureaucracy became a force that wanted to destroy the American societies. But I don't think the reason the government's pushing so hard is because of polarization. Because if you're in a society where you view the other side as Satanists who want to completely destroy everything you love, you will try as hard as possible to push your faction, even if it's immoral. Or back in the 50s, if Eisenhower wins over, who was the Democrat candidate in 1956?
I don't know.
Yeah, over a random Democrat.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter because you've got the same values and you'll live in the same country.
That's a good point. Yeah. Orion 9191 says, "Hey, what if all his? I wish your podcast audio was better. I want to listen to the podcast."
Yeah, I wish that too.
What's going on there? Do you just have bad audio? So
the podcast was horrible for the first couple episodes. So don't judge their podcast based off that, because
so you got the audio issues worked out.
I use the microphone as my main channel, and I've got a couple microphones that are between $200 to $400 in cost, and so they're good quality microphones, and I use them for the main channel. What the problem was for the podcast, they sounded incredibly quiet, and then so I just stopped using those microphones, and I just talk into my camera and my computer, and that makes an okay sound. But I'm talking to an audio expert this Monday to figure out how to fix it, so it's not going to be a problem for much longer.
Great. Let's see. Mark Twain's Revenge. Thank you so much for the $100. It's very generous of you. Says there's something seriously sick in many of our older inner cities. I spend 2 to 4 days a week in New Haven, where we own property, where you have Yale juxtaposed to multi-generational poverty welfare families. Yale is there and they can't figure it out.
Yeah. I'm from Philly. It's the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
You guys good to wrap this in 15?
Sure.
Yeah, sure. Okay. I mean, we can wrap up now if you got to go.
I've got company later, so I want to like make dinner and get ready and
well,
stuff.
let's just wrap up now then. We we're going to stream longer and we're going to watch a video and react to a ContraPoints video.
Oh, I don't need to get going now. I'm fine if we go for another 15.
Okay, sure. We'll ask a couple more questions then. Yeah.
Let's see. Hey, Theowolf for $20 says, hey, Rudyard, what do you think of modern architecture? Does it have to do with political ideology, or is it just representative of dying culture? And what do you think of people who want to remake the Roman Empire?
Yes. Yeah, the answer is yes to that, because modern architecture came out of the world wars, and there was this concept that you shouldn't have political or philosophic ideas. And that's actually, it's one of those catch-22s where we shouldn't have philosophic or political ideas becomes a philosophic and political idea. And it's juxtaposed with the human condition where we're biologically engineered for those things. And so wokeness is like an interesting philosophic endpoint of that, because the concept that the underlying assumption behind wokeness is that the majority culture has no value. And then if the majority culture has no value, you have to glorify everything else. And like modern architecture it's not woke. That would be a silly thing to say, but it's part of the same nihilism that ended up with wokeness. Because with wokeness, our idea was, we're not going to believe in anything. We're just going to be practical. But then that wasn't sustainable. And then it evolved into wokeness. And so modern architecture, there's a great book called The Geography of Nowhere about this. It's not political, but through not being political, it becomes political. And if you want to revitalize the Roman Empire, that's insane. Like, that's not going to happen. I don't know what to tell you. I mean, America is kind of the new Roman Empire. We've unified the European continent for the first time ever. And like in sheer scope of power, we're stronger than the Romans. But like, is Italy going to conquer the entire Mediterranean? They tried that under Mussolini, and they couldn't beat the Greeks.
Right. Yeah. I mean, when people say that, are they literally talking about Rome, or they just mean like the spirit of Rome?
I mean, a lot of history dudes are just LARPing. Like, right. I've run a history show for 10 years, and the biggest views are just topics people like to LARP on. People like to LARP as Romans, Crusaders, World War II, etc.
Yeah. I actually made a meme. I never ended up posting it. That was like, the Wojak guy, the whole men are always thinking about Rome. And it's like the men are always thinking about Roman, like the Roman people. And then it's like the Romans are always thinking about some previous empire, and the previous empire is thinking of a previous empire. And basically like the hunter-gatherers thinking about being like a monkey. It's like everyone's just thinking there's some magical time in the past where everything was better. It's like, okay, maybe.
Trying to think of what the Romans were aspiring to. The Romans really admired the Greeks. I don't know if they had a bigger empire in mind that came before them. I found the whole Roman Empire meme interesting because it highlighted a gender split that I was aware of, where my YouTube channel is 96% male. And I'm not a boys channel, no girls allowed. It's just, I make history content, and it kind of self-selected. And so I found that pretty funny, because it was something that I had been aware of that I hadn't seen anyone else draw attention to.
Okay, you should make a history of fashion video and see what happens. Maybe you can
I had one video that was 60% female, which was the Handmaid's Tale, and it was what would happen if the Handmaid's Tale happened.
Oh, there you go.
And there was 60% female viewership on that video?
Of course.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
They all want it. That's the truth.
I know. That's what I'm wondering. Like, does that mean they're interested? They're looking at it like a how-to or how to avoid?
Handmaid's Tale is one of my favorite books ever. I think it's really well written. I'm not going to get too red-pilled on that. I will say that 50 Shades of Grey was the most popular book in the country right when Me Too started.
There you go.
Right.
Bloomer Media for $5 says, "Hey, what if? Please make a list of books you've read and or recommended."
I mean, bro, like this is my shell on Asian and classical history.
Yeah.
That's European history. I've tried to make the list and it's too long.
Well, you can make like your top 10. How about that?
Yeah, that's what you do.
Yeah.
My Goodreads is publicly available, and that is a record of basically every book I've read. And that's something I've been wanting to work on for a long time. And I tried to record a video, and that just became 3 hours.
Let's see. Someone said Marcelius Dorada says, what if alt history? Why do you play Byzantine in EU4 so much?
I don't. I've actually never played EU4 in my life.
Wow. Fake news. Oh my God. Okay.
Maybe somebody has your screen name or something.
There you go.
This is one of those LARPs because I've talked a lot about the Turkish Empire in my videos where I think Turkey, this was a meme like a year ago because I haven't spoken at the Turkish Empire in a year, where I've frequently said Turkey's going to have a major empire. But people have like extrapolated this, that there's a myth I have a Turkish girlfriend. There's a myth that I like am paid by the Turkish government.
Yeah.
And none of that's true. And it's funny, like myths still spread around the internet and they're just not true. And people will say, Rudyard, your only area, you just play Hearts of Iron and Europa Universalis. You don't actually study history. And the irony is I've never played any of those games. I've played Hearts of Iron for about like 40 minutes and I stopped because it felt too much like homework.
You said you played Civ, I thought, a bunch, didn't you?
Yeah, I played Civ a lot, but people always go for the Paradox games to say that I'm not like serious. And it's funny, my critics go for the things that are the most easy to disprove. Like they'll say I don't do research. They'll say I'm making this crap up. And I think there's a million things you can criticize me about. Criticize me because it's correct.
Right. Rogue Elephant for $20 says, so any suggestions on where in the US to ride out the civilizational collapse? Asking for a friend. Love you all. Have a great day.
I don't know. I think near food, it's stable. I feel comfortable in Texas. You'll probably be like, you're probably safest in, I don't know, like Iowa. But I mean, lots of people over prep and life is life. And you just got to see how things happen because it's impossible to predict the future. And think of all those guys in the 1980s who built bunkers in the middle of the Rocky Mountains, thinking there'd be a civilizational collapse. And maybe we'll have one now when our society's falling apart. But those guys wasted 40 years of their lives in bunkers in the Rockies where they could have been having fun.
Oh my God. You know how like in Fallout, you know, everything's the 50s aesthetic because that was like the trend that was popular when everyone went into the bunkers. Could you imagine how awful it would be if like the future is Fallout, the aesthetic is like awful Zoomer speak because it's the aesthetic when we all go into the bunkers.
I think Zoomers want to kill themselves too much for that. I don't think like, it's fun. One of the things I've picked up on is the two sources of Zoomer slang are 4chan and rappers. That is not a good society. When incels are inventing the cultural terminology for young people, you are completely broken as a culture.
Right.
That's a great point.
That is.
Yeah.
One of the other things is all, except for rap, and I don't consider rappers to be part of the left wing because they're just not culturally. It's interesting to see how the right invented all the new slang, which is something that would have been insane 30 years ago.
I know. It's so weird.
Because like I'll talk to left-wing people and I'll say, what slang do you use? And like woke people don't have slang. I mean, like you could say cancel culture or woke, or that is a form of slang, the terminology the left uses. But it's different from what the right does because the right slang encompasses all of life. Wagey, Stacy, beta bucks,
based, soy.
Yeah.
Well, it feels like it's weird. It's whoever's counterculture creates all the memes and slang essentially. And since the woke has become like the managerial overlords, like it's weird. You have the right wingers who are supposed to be the conservatives, at least the young right wingers who are like the rebels in this bizarre like.
And it's funny that the left can claim to be. This is a shell game I see the left play a lot. They'll claim to be like the outsiders and the people who are downtrodden, and they're supporting the weak. And they run all of society's institutions.
Yeah, they're the establishment.
What evidence would you need to have for that you guys run society? that you don't have. And this is like, there's no feedback loop for evidence in the left's worldview. It's about psychological stability. And this is one of the arguments I get into where people say real communism has never been tried. And I say, you guys got a third of the human race. If that's not enough, your ideology is horrible. I don't like, because the thing is, capitalism started with the Netherlands and Britain in the 1600s, who are constantly under attack. And that in the parts of the Cold War, you could have made the point that the capitalists were the ones who were the underdogs because they owned less of the world, less of the population, less resources. And it's just, pick a theory that works.
But that's such a testament to the flimsiness of the theory, because if the theory can dominate a third of the minds of the world and still it doesn't work, I mean, obviously it's a terrible ideology.
Also a testament to how emotionally strong the theory is.
Oh,
if the theory can propagate that hard and has faced that many defeats, it signifies like how well constructed leftist theory is for the human mind.
Well, it's based on very primitive moral intuitions. Back when we used to hunt and share everything equally from the hunt. That's basically the same primal moral intuitions that go into socialism. So obviously it would never work in a modern economy, but those moral intuitions are what still people crave. So it seems intuitively correct, even though every time it's actually been attempted in the real world, it's been a catastrophic failure.
Yeah, I agree with that. Any final points you guys want to make?
No, this was a great talk. Yeah,
this was a real pleasure. You guys are a lot smarter than a lot of other podcasts I've been on.
Well, look, you have a standing invitation here. You reach out to me if you want to come on and just review a video with us. Just test out a new idea, whatever you want. Like, we have a bunch of people that just pop in and come on the show whenever they're available. So,
okay. Well, thank you very much.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we'll let you go.
Okay.
Take care, man. Thanks for talking to us.
Bye.
Hi, you just listened to a clip from the Sitch and Adams show. If you like what you heard, you can listen to our live show right here on this channel on Sunday, starting at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. And if you want, you can super chat us. We read $20 and up super chats on the show and then do a follow-up stream on the following Tuesday where we read the rest of the unread super chats and interact with fans of the show. Subscribe to this channel right here to listen to the live show or to listen to more of our awesome clips.